I can see the faint outline of a harbor somewhere along the edge of a vast ocean where wooden ships rest gently against weathered docks, their masts swaying like tall reeds in an evening breeze. The year is 1764, and the world feels both impossibly large and strangely intimate, as if every decision made in distant halls might ripple across thousands of miles of dark water, reaching shores where merchants count their barrels, where customs officers shuffle through manifests by candlelight, where the very idea of sugar carries weight beyond its sweetness. There is something about this moment, this particular spring, when Parliament gathers in London, and the air in the colonies feels different somehow, charged with a kind of quiet anticipation, though perhaps no one yet knows exactly why. I find myself drawn to the docks at twilight, when the work of the day has softened into shadow, and the smell of molasses hangs thick in the humid air, mingling with salt and tar and the earthy scent of timber. These are the hours when the world reveals its textures, when commerce becomes something more than ledgers and coin, when it transforms into barrels and hogsheads, into the creak of rope and the splash of oars, into the murmured conversations of sailors who have seen islands most will never know. Sugar, molasses, rum. These words echo through the warehouses like a kind of mantra, not mystical but essential, woven into the fabric of daily existence in ways both visible and hidden. A merchant might calculate his profits. A distiller might tend his stills. A ship's captain might plot his course through Caribbean waters, and each of them moves within an invisible architecture of laws and customs, of regulations written by men who have never felt tropical rain or tasted the raw bite of fresh-cut cane. The Sugar Act, though that name will come to feel almost too simple for what it represents, arrives not with thunder but with the quiet authority of official documents, sealed and stamped and carried across an ocean. Its formal title stretches longer. The American Revenue Act, words that promise order and structure, that speak of His Majesty's treasury and the proper administration of trade. But beneath the formality lies something more complicated, a reshaping of relationships, an attempt to turn what had been loose and flexible into something firm and enforceable. I watch the lamplighters make their rounds as daylight fades to that deep blue that comes just before true darkness, and I think about how laws are like light, creating boundaries between what is seen and what remains in shadow, between what is permitted and what becomes suddenly forbidden, between one way of living and another that has not yet fully taken shape. The colonies themselves feel like a collection of separate worlds, connected by coastline and commerce, but distinct in character. Boston with its tight streets and fervent debates, New York with its polyglot bustle, Philadelphia with its orderly ambition, Charleston with its rice and indigo, Newport with its merchant princes, each city a universe unto itself, each harbor a gateway to elsewhere, and through them all flows the sweet dark current of sugar trade, legal and otherwise, sanctioned and smuggled, recorded and invisible. Before this act, there had been another, the Molasses Act of 1733, which had imposed duties so high they might have strangled trade entirely, except that enforcement had been gentle, one might say, or perhaps simply negligent. The gap between law and practice had grown so wide that an entire economy had flourished in the space between. Ships had sailed, molasses had flowed, Distilleries had prospered, and the royal customs officials had collected far less than the regulations suggested they should. Now, in this spring of 1764, Kuchi, something shifts. The war with France has ended. That great conflict that stretched across continents and consumed vast sums, leaving Britain victorious but deeply in debt. The territories are larger now, the responsibilities multiplied, and somewhere in the halls of power, men calculate what it costs to maintain an empire, to station troops, to administer vast new lands, to patrol seas and enforce sovereignty, and so they turn their attention to the colonies, to these prosperous ports and growing cities, to the merchants who have grown wealthy on trade, and they see perhaps an untapped source of revenue, a way to make the colonies contribute more substantially to their own defense, to the grand imperial project of which they are a part. The act itself, when it arrives, is a curious thing. It actually lowers the duty on foreign molasses from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence, which might seem generous, except that the old rate was rarely enforced, while this new rate will be collected with vigor, with new courts and new officers, and new ships patrolling the coastlines. The mathematics of empire, calculating that a lower tax rigorously enforced will yield more revenue than a higher tax casually ignored. I stand at the water's edge, watching the tide come in, slow and inexorable, and I sense that something similar is happening in the realm of policy. A slow rising of authority, a gradual assertion of control, not dramatic, not sudden, but patient and methodical, like water finding its level. The roots of this moment stretch back further than 1764, back through decades of navigation acts and trade regulations, back to the very founding of the colonies themselves, when England first began to imagine what it meant to govern territories across an ocean, to shape their commerce, to channel their wealth toward the mother country. In 1651, Parliament had passed the first Navigation Act, establishing a principle that would echo through the generations, that colonial trade existed not for its own sake, but as an instrument of English prosperity. The act required that goods moving between England and its colonies travel only on English ships, crewed primarily by English sailors, creating a protected maritime world where Dutch and French vessels found themselves suddenly excluded from profits they had long enjoyed. These early laws carried a certain logic, born of mercantilism, that economic philosophy which viewed trade as a kind of contest, where one nation's gain meant another's loss, where the accumulation of gold and silver measured power, and where colonies existed primarily to enrich the realm that claimed them. Under this view, the American colonies should provide raw materials England needed, purchase manufactured goods England produced, and, above all, conduct their commerce in ways that strengthened English shipping and filled English coffers. The system grew more elaborate over time, layer upon layer of regulation. The Navigation Act of 1660 expanded the list of enumerated goods, those products that could be shipped only to England or other English colonies, never directly to foreign ports. Sugar appeared on this list, along with tobacco and cotton and indigo, each commodity bound by invisible chains to English docks, required to pass through English hands before reaching the wider world. For the sugar islands of the Caribbean, this created a kind of golden captivity. Barbados, Jamaica, the Leeward Islands, These places produced sugar in quantities that astonished European markets. Their plantations stretched across hillsides, worked by enslaved people torn from Africa, creating wealth on a scale that seemed almost fantastic. The white crystalline substance that emerged from their mills and boiling houses commanded high prices, and under the Navigation Acts, all of it flowed toward England, enriching merchants and factors, generating customs revenues, feeding refineries in London and Bristol. But the northern colonies, places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York, found themselves in a different position. They produced fewer goods that England desperately wanted. Their timber and fish and grain served useful purposes, but did not generate the spectacular profits of sugar or tobacco. Yet they too needed to purchase English manufactured goods, needed to participate in the commercial empire, needed to find some way to balance their accounts. And here, in this asymmetry, emerged the molasses trade, a circulation of goods that would define the northern colonial economy. The sugar islands produced molasses as a byproduct, that thick dark syrup left behind when sugar crystals formed. In the islands themselves, molasses held limited value. The planters focused on sugar, on that refined white product that fetched premium prices, and the molasses accumulated, barrels and barrels of it, looking for markets. The northern colonies discovered they could purchase this molasses cheaply, particularly from the French islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe, where French planters cared even less about the byproduct than their English counterparts. The French focused almost exclusively on sugar for European markets and sold their molasses at prices far below what English islands charged. Colonial merchants sent their ships south, riding the winds and currents down the Atlantic coast, carrying timber and dried fish and provisions, goods the sugar islands needed to sustain their operations. These ships would return laden with molasses, which flowed into the distilleries that multiplied along the northern coast. In these establishments, the molasses underwent transformation, heating in copper stills, emerging as rum, clear or dark, harsh or smooth, so a spirit that found ready markets everywhere. This rum served many purposes. Colonists drank it themselves naturally and in taverns and home, at celebrations and gatherings, but it also became a medium of exchange. Traders carried rum to Africa, where it formed part of the terrible commerce in human beings, purchasing enslaved people who would be transported to the plantations, completing a triangle of trade that bound 3 continents in relationships of exploitation and profit. The rum also went to Newfoundland, where fishing fleets needed provisions. It went to the wine islands, Madeira and the Canaries, in exchange for wines that colonial merchants could then sell in England. It even went to the sugar islands themselves, where planters and overseers and sailors all desired spirits, creating a curious circular trade where molasses left the islands, became rum in colonial distilleries, and returned as a finished product. This entire system operated somewhat outside the formal imperial framework, or perhaps alongside it. The Navigation Acts had not anticipated how central molasses would become to northern colonial prosperity, had not imagined the distilleries that would multiply, the ships that would sail, the web of trade routes that would develop. And when Parliament finally recognized that vast quantities of French molasses were enriching colonial merchants while bypassing English customs, they moved to assert control. The Molasses Act of 1733 emerged from pressure by the English sugar islands. The planters there, seeing colonial merchants purchase French molasses, complained bitterly that this trade undermined their own interests. If the northern colonies would only buy English molasses, even at higher prices, the sugar islands would profit more. The act therefore imposed a duty of 6 pence per gallon on foreign molasses, along with substantial duties on foreign sugar and rum, rates calculated to make French products prohibitively expensive, to force colonial merchants back toward English suppliers. But enforcement proved difficult, perhaps impossible. The American coastline stretched for hundreds of miles, punctuated by countless harbors and inlets and rivers. Customs officials were few, often corrupt, sometimes sympathetic to local merchants. The very geography of the colonies worked against tight control. A ship might anchor in a quiet cove, transfer its cargo to smaller boats, land the molasses miles from any customs house, and by the time officials learned of the cargo, it had already disappeared into warehouses and distilleries. Moreover, colonial merchants developed sophisticated methods of evasion. They kept double sets of books, declared only a portion of their cargo, paid bribes to friendly officials, obtained blank customs documents they could fill in as needed. The line between legal commerce and smuggling blurred until it nearly vanished. What the law called illegal, the merchants called simply business, a practical response to regulations they viewed as unjust and economically ruinous. And so for 3 decades, the Molasses Act remained largely a fiction, a law on paper that generated minimal revenue. Colonial distilleries continued to flourish. Ships continued to sail to French islands. The northern colonial economy hummed along, producing rum, building ships, developing a merchant class of increasing wealth and confidence. And in London, Parliament noticed this prosperity, noticed that their own regulations generated far less customs revenue than expected, noticed the gap between theory and practice. The 7 Years' War changed everything. That global conflict, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, raged from 1756 to 1763. Consuming resources on an unprecedented scale, Britain and France fought across multiple continents, in Europe and India and the Caribbean and the forests of North America. The war required massive expenditures for troops and ships and supplies, for subsidies to allies, for the entire machinery of 18th century warfare. Britain emerged victorious. France ceded Canada and territories east of the Mississippi. Spain surrendered Florida. The British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent yet, but victory came at an enormous cost. The national debt had nearly doubled, reaching a sum that alarmed even the most optimistic ministers. And now this enlarged empire required administration, required troops to garrison frontiers posts, required naval squadrons to patrol expanded waters, required officials to govern new territories, all of which demanded ongoing expenditure. George Grenville, who became prime minister in 1763, surveyed this situation with the eye of a man who prided himself on fiscal prudence. He saw an empire deep in debt. He saw colonies that had benefited from British military protection, and he saw revenue collection systems that leaked money at every turn. The American colonies, prosperous and growing, contributed relatively little to imperial expenses. Their customs revenues barely covered the costs of collection, while smuggling remained endemic. Grenville determined to address this situation, to make the empire pay for itself, to extract from the colonies a fairer share of the costs of their own defense and administration. The Sugar Act, formally introduced in March of 1764, represented his first major attempt at reform, not a revolutionary change, not a dramatic break with the past, but rather an effort to make existing systems actually work, to transform paper regulations into enforced reality. The Act's preamble spoke of raising revenue openly and directly. Previous navigation acts had focused on regulating trade, on channeling commerce in preferred directions. This act explicitly stated that its purpose was to generate income for the Crown, to help offset the costs of defending and securing the American territories. The language itself marked a shift from regulation to taxation, from commercial policy to revenue extraction. The details of the act itself revealed the thinking of men who believed administration could solve what leniency had allowed to flourish. The duty on foreign molasses dropped from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, a reduction that seemed generous on its surface, but accompanied by provisions that transformed the entire enforcement apparatus. New vice admiralty courts would try smuggling cases without juries, placing judgment in the hands of royally appointed judges rather than sympathetic local citizens. The burden of proof shifted, requiring accused merchants to demonstrate their innocence rather than forcing the Crown to prove guilt. Additional items joined the list of enumerated goods. Coffee and pimiento and certain types of wine now fell under tighter regulation. Iron and lumber faced new restrictions. The act even addressed wine from Madeira, that Portuguese archipelago whose sweet fortified vintages had long been a profitable item of colonial trade. Now such wine could only enter the colonies through England, adding time and expense and the involvement of English middlemen to what had been direct commerce, but perhaps most significantly, the Act funded expanded enforcement. It allocated money for more customs officers, more ships to patrol the coast, more officials to inspect warehouses and docks. The Royal Navy received instructions to assist in customs enforcement. Warships that had fought the French now turned their attention to colonial merchants, their captains authorized to stop and search vessels, to seize suspicious cargo, to deliver accused smugglers to the new courts. I imagine standing in a customs house as these changes take effect, watching officers sort through new regulations, their fingers tracing down pages of instructions. The paperwork multiplies. Every shipment now requires more detailed documentation, certificates of origin, sworn statements about cargo contents, bonds posted to guarantee compliance, the casual arrangements of the past, the nod and wink, the looking the other way. These informal accommodations become suddenly dangerous for both merchants and officials. A ship arrives at Boston Harbor, its hold filled with molasses from Martinique. The captain had made this voyage a dozen times before, knew the usual procedures, the expected fees, both official and unofficial, but now he finds himself facing a different reality. Officers board his vessel and conduct a thorough inspection, comparing his manifest against the actual cargo, measuring the hogsheads, taking samples. The process takes hours, then days, while his molasses sits in the hold, and he calculates the mounting costs of delay. They find discrepancies. Of course they do. The manifest declares one quantity. The inspection reveals another. Perhaps the captain had hoped to land some portion quietly to avoid duty on the full amount. Perhaps he had obtained his paperwork from a friendly official who understood the traditional flexibility. But now these small evasions carry real consequences. His cargo faces seizure. He faces prosecution in Vice Admiralty Court without a jury of fellow merchants who might sympathize, without the protection that local sentiment might provide. The news spreads through the merchant community like wind across water. Stories circulate in coffee houses and taverns of ships detained, of cargo confiscated, of trials that seem designed to produce convictions. The old certainties dissolve. The calculations that had governed trade for decades no longer apply. A merchant who had planned his ventures assuming minimal enforcement now confronts a system that actually collects what the law demands, and the mathematics prove brutal. A gallon of French molasses might cost 4 pence. Adding 3 pence in duty raises the cost to 7 pence. English molasses from the Sugar Islands might cost 8 pence or 9 pence. The gap narrows, but does not close. French molasses remains cheaper, yet not so cheap that the risk of seizure makes smuggling worthwhile. The act achieves exactly what Grenville intended, making legal trade more attractive than illegal, not through prohibition, but through calculation, through making the honest payment of duties the rational economic choice. The distillers feel the pressure most acutely. Their businesses depended on cheap molasses, on the abundance that French islands provided. Their stills had been designed for continuous operation, consuming molasses in quantities that required the lowest possible prices. Now they face a choice: pay the higher duties and reduce their profits, or raise the price of rum and risk losing customers, or reduce production and leave their stills idle. Some distillers attempt to pass the costs forward. Rum prices creep upward. Tavern keepers grumble. Consumers notice. The spirit that had been affordable to common sailors and laborers becomes a luxury, or at least less accessible. The ripple effects spread outward. Ships that had carried rum to Africa find their cargoes less competitive. Traders who had exchanged rum for other goods discover their medium of exchange has lost value. Others seek alternative suppliers, perhaps English molasses, despite the higher cost, at least avoiding the duty and the risk. But the English islands cannot produce enough. Their plantations focus on sugar, and their molasses output falls short of colonial demand. Scarcity develops. Prices rise further. The entire careful balance of the triangular trade begins to shift and buckle in the royal customs houses. The new regime brings its own complications. Officers who had grown accustomed to the old casual system now face pressure to perform, to demonstrate results, to justify the expanded enforcement apparatus. They receive instructions to be vigilant, to suspect every shipment, to assume evasion rather than honesty. The relationship between customs officials and merchants, never warm, becomes actively antagonistic. Some officers embrace their new authority with zeal. They see themselves as servants of the crown, enforcing rightful laws against men who had grown too comfortable with violation. They board ships at all hours, demand to see every document, question every declaration. Their diligence generates seizures and prosecutions, but also delays and disruptions. Legitimate merchants find their operations hampered by inspections that assume guilt. Other officers, perhaps more sympathetic to local concerns, or simply more pragmatic, find themselves caught between instructions from London and the reality of colonial ports. They know the merchants, understand the traditional practices, recognize that overzealous enforcement might strangle trade entirely, yet they also know that failure to collect adequate revenue will mark them as incompetent or corrupt. They navigate a narrow path, trying to enforce enough to satisfy their superiors while not alienating the community entirely. The Vice Admiralty courts begin their work. These institutions, sitting without juries, operating under Admiralty law rather than common law, become theaters of resentment. A merchant accused of smuggling stands before a judge appointed by the Crown. The judge has incentives to convict, sharing in the value of seized goods. The merchant cannot appeal to local sympathies, cannot hope that his neighbors will nullify an unjust law through their verdict. He can only present his case and await judgment. The verdicts tend toward conviction. Ships and cargo disappear into royal possession, sold at auction, the proceeds divided among the Crown, the informer, the judge, a system designed to be self-funding through the very violations it prosecutes, creating perverse incentives where officials profit from finding guilt, where every ship becomes a potential prize, where the machinery of justice transforms into an engine of revenue extraction. Colonial newspapers begin to take notice. Printers in Boston and New York and Philadelphia publish accounts of seized ships, of trials that seem predetermined, of merchants ruined by what they view as excessive enforcement of unjust laws. The articles adopt tones ranging from measured concern to outright indignation. They question whether Parliament has the right to tax the colonies for revenue, whether the traditional British liberty of trial by jury can be suspended, whether these policies serve the empire's true interests. Some writers invoke principles. They speak of rights as Englishmen, of constitutional limitations on parliamentary power, of the distinction between external taxes that regulate trade and internal taxes that raise revenue. The Sugar Act, they argue, crosses a line. It abandons the pretense of commercial regulation and explicitly seeks to extract money from the colonies without their consent. Without representation in Parliament, they cannot be justly taxed. The phrase begins to circulate, appearing in pamphlets and letters, in speeches and sermons. Taxation without representation, a principle that will echo far beyond this moment. Others focus on practical consequences. They calculate the economic damage, ships sitting idle because merchants cannot afford the duties, distilleries closing because rum no longer turns a profit, sailors unemployed because trade has contracted. The argument runs that Britain benefits from colonial prosperity, that a thriving colonial economy purchases more British manufactured goods, generates more shipping for British vessels, contributes more to imperial wealth than any customs revenue might provide. The Sugar Act, in seeking to extract a few £1,000s in duties, risks damaging a commercial relationship worth hundreds of thousands. In London, Grenville and his supporters view these complaints with limited sympathy. The colonies, they observe, enjoyed British military protection during the recent war. British troops fought and died to secure their frontiers. British ships patrolled their coasts. British taxpayers funded expeditions that expanded colonial territories. Now, with the war won and the debt mounting, the colonies balk at contributing even a modest share toward the costs of their own defense and administration. The revenue projections seemed reasonable. The colonies imported vast quantities of molasses. If even half of it paid the threepence duty, the annual revenue might reach 40 or 50,000 pounds. Not enough to erase the deficit, but a meaningful contribution. And if enforcement worked as intended, if smuggling declined and compliance increased, the amount might grow. Meanwhile, the principle would be established that Parliament could legislate for the colonies, could impose taxes for revenue, could expect obedience to its will, but the actual collections fall short of expectations. Merchants prove adaptable, finding new ways to minimize their tax burden. They import less molasses overall, accepting reduced production rather than higher costs. They shift to alternative sources, seeking out Portuguese or Spanish islands where enforcement remains lax. They continue to smuggle, though more carefully, accepting greater risk in exchange for lower prices. The Vice Admiralty courts secure convictions, but cannot catch every violation, cannot inspect every cargo, cannot seal every inlet where a small boat might land molasses in the dark. The summer of 1764 brings a peculiar tension to the colonial ports. The act has been in force for several months now, long enough for its effects to become visible, but not so long that anyone knows how the story will end. Merchants adjust their strategies, customs officers refine their methods, and beneath the surface of daily commerce, something larger stirs, a question about authority and consent that has no easy answer. In Rhode Island, that small colony whose prosperity depended heavily on the molasses trade, the impact cuts especially deep. Newport had grown rich on triangular commerce, its distilleries producing rum in prodigious quantities, its merchants operating fleets of ships that ranged from the Caribbean to Africa to Newfoundland. The town's elegant houses, its busy wharves, its sophisticated mercantile networks, all rested on foundations of cheap molasses and profitable rum. Now those foundations tremble. Distillers reduce operations, some close entirely. Unable to make the economics work under the new regime, ship owners find fewer profitable voyages available. Sailors seek work elsewhere. The ripple effects touch everyone, from the coopers who made barrels, to the chandlers who supplied ships, to the tavern keepers who served the maritime community. A town built on trade feels trade constrict, and the mood darkens accordingly. The Rhode Island Assembly debates how to respond. They draft petitions to Parliament, carefully worded documents that protest the act while affirming loyalty to the Crown. They argue economic necessity, pointing out that the northern colonies lack gold and silver, that they depend on trade to generate the currency needed to purchase British goods, that restrictions on that trade undermine the very commercial relationship that benefits Britain. The petitions speak of rights, but frame them in terms of mutual interest rather than confrontation. Massachusetts takes a more assertive stance. Samuel Adams, a Boston merchant and political organizer, begins to articulate arguments that question Parliament's authority more directly. He writes under various pseudonyms, his articles appearing in the Boston Gazette, suggesting that the colonies possess rights that even Parliament cannot violate, that taxation requires consent, that representation cannot be virtual or theoretical, but must be actual and direct. These ideas find receptive audiences, particularly among merchants who feel the Sugar Act's bite, but also among lawyers and ministers and educated colonists who follow political theory. They discuss Locke and Montesquieu, debate the nature of the British Constitution, ask whether the relationship between Britain and the colonies resembles that between Parliament and English counties, or whether the colonies occupy some different status, something more autonomous, more akin to separate realms sharing a monarch. The debates remain mostly theoretical at this stage, argued in newspaper columns and tavern conversations, not yet translated into organized resistance. Most colonists still view themselves as British subjects, proud of the empire, grateful for its protection, hoping that reasonable argument might persuade Parliament to reconsider, that Grenville might recognize the policy's flaws and adjust accordingly. The possibility of fundamental rupture seems remote, almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands watched these developments with mixed feelings. The planters there had lobbied for the Molasses Act decades earlier, had complained about colonial merchants buying French molasses. Yet they too operate within the imperial system. They too know the weight of regulation. And some among them wonder whether stricter enforcement might eventually affect their own interests, whether the principle of parliamentary taxation, once established, might expand in unexpected directions. The fall brings the first test of organized colonial response. The Massachusetts Assembly proposes a joint meeting of colonial representatives, a Congress to coordinate petitions and present a unified voice to Parliament. The idea gains traction slowly. Some colonies enthusiastically support it. Others hesitate, worried about appearing too unified, too organized, too much like a separate political entity rather than individual provinces of the Crown. The Stamp Act looms on the horizon, though few yet know its shape. Grenville continues to search for revenue. The Sugar Act has proven disappointing in its collections, generating far less than projected. He begins to contemplate more direct forms of taxation, duties that cannot be evaded through smuggling, that touch every colonist regardless of their involvement in maritime trade. But that belongs to the next year, to 1765, when the nature of a colonial discontent will transform from merchant complaints into something broader and more volatile. For now, in late 1764, the Sugar Act remains the focus. The customs houses continue their work. The Vice Admiralty courts hear their cases. Merchants adapt and maneuver. Some find the new system tolerable, even profitable if they can undercut competitors who still attempt to smuggle. Others sink into bankruptcy, victims of changing rules and vigorous enforcement. The colonial economy adjusts, contracts in some areas, finds new channels in others, demonstrates the resilience of commercial networks under pressure. The enforcement itself proves costly. The expanded customs service requires salaries. The naval patrols consume resources. The Vice Admiralty courts need judges and clerks and facilities. When the accountants in London tally the costs against the revenues, the balance looks less impressive than Grenville had hoped. The net gain barely justifies the effort, and certainly falls far short of making a significant dent in the imperial debt. But the Act's significance extends beyond the pounds and shillings it collects. It establishes precedents. It demonstrates that Parliament will legislate for the colonies, will enforce those laws, will resist local opposition. It tests colonial responses, revealing which arguments gain traction, which forms of resistance emerge, how unified the colonies might become when facing a common grievance. In this sense, the Sugar Act serves as a rehearsal, a preliminary act in a much longer drama. Some historians will later argue that the act itself was reasonable, that 3 pence per gallon on molasses represented a modest duty, that the colonies could well afford to contribute something toward imperial expenses, that Grenville's logic was sound even if his execution proved flawed. They will point out that the act reduced the official tax rate, that it aimed at enforcement rather than confiscation, that it sought order rather than oppression. Others will see in the act the seeds of revolution, not because of its specific provisions, but because of the principles it embodied. The explicit statement that Parliament could tax for revenue, the use of vice admiralty courts without juries, the assumption that colonial interests should yield to imperial needs, the willingness to damage colonial economies in pursuit of modest gains. These elements, they argue, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the colonial relationship, a failure to recognize that distance and self-governance had created societies that could not be managed like English counties. Both interpretations contain truth. The act was both reasonable and provocative, both modest and threatening, both a practical revenue measure and a constitutional assertion. The ambiguity itself created problems. If Parliament had declared openly that it possessed unlimited authority to tax the colonies, the confrontation might have come sooner, but perhaps more cleanly. If instead Parliament had sought colonial approval through their own assemblies, the revenue might have come voluntarily, but the middle path, asserting authority while calling it reasonable, demanding compliance while expecting gratitude, this approach satisfied neither imperial needs nor colonial sensibilities. Through the winter of 1764 into 1765, the machinery of the Sugar Act continues to operate. Ships come and go, duties are paid or evaded, courts convict or acquit. The daily rhythm of enforcement becomes routine, almost mundane. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, attitudes shift. Merchants who pay duties resent them. Those who refuse and face prosecution grow bitter. Colonists who never traded in molasses begin to pay attention, wondering if today's customs duties might become tomorrow's land taxes or poll taxes or taxes on documents. The conversations in colonial taverns and coffee houses take on new dimensions. Where once men debated shipping routes and market prices, now they discuss constitutional theory, natural rights, the limits of parliamentary sovereignty. Books and pamphlets circulate, Locke's treatises on government, Montesquieu's analysis of liberty, English opposition writers who had critiqued the growth of executive power. These texts, written in different times for different purposes, find new relevance in colonial contexts, become ammunition in arguments about authority and freedom. Colonial lawyers prove particularly engaged. Men trained in English common law who see in the vice admiralty courts a violation of traditional protections, James Otis in Massachusetts, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania, Patrick Henry in Virginia. These and others begin to craft legal arguments against parliamentary taxation, not as revolution, not yet, but as defense of what they understand to be their rights as Englishmen. Their rhetoric combines conservative appeals to tradition with innovative claims about colonial status. They argue simultaneously that they deserve the same rights as Englishmen in Britain, and that their distance and circumstances create special considerations that Parliament must respect. The colonial assemblies, those elected bodies that had long managed local affairs, find themselves in an awkward position. They possess real power within their colonies. They vote taxes, appropriate funds, pass local legislation, but they also exist at Parliament's sufferance. Their authority derives from royal charters that Parliament could theoretically revoke. They want to assert colonial rights without appearing to claim independence, to resist what they view as unconstitutional taxation without rejecting parliamentary sovereignty entirely. The logical contradictions in this position will eventually become untenable. But for now, in 1765, they attempt to navigate the narrow space between submission and rebellion. The Sugar Act itself will remain in force for years, modified occasionally, its rates adjusted, its provisions refined. But its real importance lies not in its longevity, but in its timing. It arrived at a moment when the colonies had grown wealthy enough to resent taxation, confident enough to question authority, connected enough to coordinate responses. Had it come earlier, when the colonies were smaller and more dependent, the reaction might have been muted. Had it come later, after other provocations had already mobilized opposition, it might have been lost in larger conflicts. But coming when it did, in 1764, it served as catalyst, transforming latent concerns into active grievances, turning theoretical debates into practical resistance. I watched the sun set over a colonial harbor, the water turning gold, and then crimson, and then deep purple, the ships at anchor rock gently, their masts dark lines against the fading light. Tomorrow they will sail, carrying their cargoes through a world of regulations and duties, of courts and customs houses, of laws made across an ocean by men who have never stood on these docks, never felt the particular quality of this air, never understood in their bones what it means to live at this distance, in this emerging society novum, poised between old identities and new possibilities. The Sugar Act exists now as something more than legislation. It has become a mirror in which the colonies begin to see themselves differently, not as scattered provinces on the edge of empire, but as societies with their own rhythms and reasons, their own sense of what justice requires, their own understanding of the relationship between power and consent. There is something almost inevitable about what unfolds, not in the sense that revolution was predetermined, but in the way that certain questions, once asked, demand answers that cannot be deferred forever. When Parliament asserts the right to tax for revenue, when it stations ships to enforce compliance, when it establishes courts that bypass local juries, it forces colonists to consider what they believe about authority, about representation, about the sources of legitimate government. These are not simple questions. They carry philosophical weight that extends beyond molasses and rum, beyond customs duties and admiralty courts. They touch the fundamental problem of how people separated by an ocean can maintain a shared political identity, whether distance itself creates new forms of sovereignty, whether the act of building communities in a new world transforms the rights and obligations of those who do the building. I think of the distiller tending his still, watching the clear liquid drip from the cooling coil. He performs this work because it brings profit, because there is demand for what he produces, because he has invested in equipment and reputation and expects to earn a living from his skill. The Sugar Act changes his calculations, forces him to decide whether to pay duties that cut his margins or to risk smuggling and face the consequences. But beyond these immediate choices, he must also consider what it means that men in London, men he has never met and who have never seen his distillery, can reshape his livelihood with a stroke of a pen. The question generalizes, if Parliament can tax molasses, can it tax anything? Can it impose levies on land, on inheritances, on newspapers, on the documents that record daily transactions? The Stamp Act will soon provide that answer. Yes, Parliament believes it can tax all these things, and the colonists will respond with a vehemence that surprises everyone, including themselves, discovering in their resistance a unity they had not known they possessed. But here, in the aftermath of the Sugar Act, the resistance remains fragmented, uncertain of its own limits. Colonial assemblies petition respectfully. Merchants grumble, but mostly comply. Lawyers craft arguments they hope will persuade rather than provoke. The possibility of reconciliation still exists. The breach still seems repairable. If only Parliament will listen, if only the King will intervene, if only reasonable men on both sides can find accommodation, this hope, this faith in the possibility of mutual understanding reflects a deep loyalty to Britain and British institutions. The colonists think of themselves as British. They take pride in British liberties, in the glorious revolution that limited royal power, in the traditions of common law and parliamentary government. They want these traditions extended to them, not abandoned. They seek inclusion, not separation, at least for now, at least in 1764 and 65, when the future remains unwritten and many paths still seem possible. The Sugar Act also reveals something about the nature of empire itself, about the tensions inherent in governing distant territories. The empire had grown through a kind of benign neglect, allowing the colonies substantial autonomy in their internal affairs, intervening mainly to regulate external trade and ensure strategic loyalty. This arrangement worked because it demanded little, asked mainly that the colonies not trade with Britain's enemies, not establish manufactures that competed with British industry, not threaten imperial interests. But the 7 Years' War changed the calculus. The expanded empire required more active governance. The enormous debt demanded new revenue sources. The policy of salutary neglect, of overlooking violations and allowing local flexibility, gave way to a vision of empire as an integrated system, efficiently administered, properly taxed, uniformly regulated. The Sugar Act embodied this new vision, this belief that rational policy and vigorous enforcement could transform colonial relationships. What the architects of this policy failed to grasp, or chose to ignore, was that decades of autonomy had created expectations, habits of self-governance that could not easily be undone. The colonial assemblies had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs. Colonial merchants had built their businesses on assumptions of minimal interference. Colonial societies had developed their own characters, their own ways of understanding rights and obligations. To suddenly impose tighter control, to dismiss local concerns as mere inconvenience, this was to misread fundamentally the societies that had emerged in the American wilderness. And so the Sugar Act becomes a beginning, not of revolution, not yet, but of a conversation about power that will grow increasingly difficult, increasingly fraught, until conversation itself becomes impossible and other forms of expression take its place. The path from threepence duty on molasses to independence and war stretches across 12 years, involves many other acts and events, encompasses boycotts and tea parties, massacres and congresses, declarations and battles. But the seeds exist here in the summer and fall of 1764, when merchants first confront the reality of enforced taxation, when assemblies first draft their careful protests, when colonists first articulate the principle that taxation requires representation. These are the opening moves in a game whose rules both sides believe they understand, but whose outcome will surprise everyone, transforming subjects into citizens, provinces into states, an empire into something new and unprecedented. The harbor grows quiet as evening deepens. The last ships of the day have secured their moorings. The customs house has closed its doors. The distilleries bank their fires for the night. In the gathering darkness, the world of the Sugar Act seems almost peaceful. Just commerce and regulation, duties paid and recorded, the ordinary machinery of imperial administration turning steadily, but beneath the surface, in conversations not yet finished, in letters being drafted, in arguments taking shape in minds that will not rest. Something else is happening. A question is being posed about consent and authority, about distance and identity, about the rights of people to shape the governments under which they live. The answer to that question will not come quickly, will not come easily, will cost more than anyone in 1764 can imagine. For now, the molasses flows, or doesn't. The duties are paid or evaded. The courts render their judgments. The ships sail on, carrying their cargoes through a world that seems solid, but is already beginning to shift, already moving toward transformations that will reshape not just the British Empire, but the very idea of what government can be, what rights mean, what consent requires. I stand at the water's edge as the stars emerge, one by one, pricking the darkening sky with light, the same stars that shine on London, on the Sugar Islands, on the coast of Africa, on ships at sea. They mark a world connected by commerce and empire, by winds and currents, by the invisible lines of authority that claim to bind scattered territories into a single realm. But they also mark distances, the vast gulf between the Thames and the Charles River, between the halls of Parliament and the coffee houses of Boston, between those who make laws and those who must live under them. And in that distance, in that separation of experience and understanding, lies the space where the future will unfold, where new ideas will take root, where the certainties of empire will give way to the experiments of republic. The night settles fully now. The harbor holds its ships in gentle darkness. Tomorrow they will sail, carrying their cargoes toward destinations known and unknown, moving through a world of regulations that seek to order their passage, to extract revenue from their commerce, to bind them to purposes they may not share. But tonight, in this quiet moment between day and night, between one era and another, they simply rest, rocking gently on the tide, waiting for the dawn, waiting for whatever comes next. The water laps against the pilings, a soft rhythmic sound that has marked these shores long before the first European ships arrived, and will continue long after the empire's rise and fall. It speaks of continuity beneath change, of the persistence of the physical world, even as the human arrangements built upon it transform and dissolve. The Sugar Act, Parliament, the British Empire itself, these are all temporary structures, attempts to impose order on the flowing chaos of human affairs. They will have their moment, their influence, their consequences, and then pass into history, Gukel's becoming stories we tell about how the present came to be. And in the telling, in the slow recitation of what happened and why, in the gentle exploration of these old conflicts and transformations, there is a kind of peace. The urgency has drained away. The passions have cooled. What remains is simply the shape of events, the pattern of cause and effect, the slow unfolding of decisions made by people who could not see their ultimate consequences, who did what seemed reasonable at the time, and set in motion currents that carried everyone, willing or not, toward shores they had not intended to reach. The darkness completes itself, stars and water, silence and distance. The story of the sugar act dissolves into the larger story of which it forms a part. And that story, too, dissolves into the even larger story of how people organize themselves, how they contest authority, how they discover what they believe only when forced to choose. And all of it flows together, past and present, cause and consequence, until the distinctions blur and there is only the gentle rhythm of time passing, of events receding into memory, of history becoming the quiet voice that speaks across the years, whispering of molasses and duties, of ships and courts, of an empire that believed it could hold an ocean in its grasp, and found instead that the ocean, patient and persistent, would always slip away. I imagine a world before light could be summoned with the flick of a finger, a world lit only by flame and the patient glow of the sun, where night fell like a curtain and mornings arrived with the slowness of tide. And in that world there lived a curiosity, quiet and persistent, about the invisible forces that moved through everything. Long before anyone understood what it was, electricity existed, waiting in the clouds, hiding in amber rubbed with wool, sleeping in the bodies of strange fish that could stun with a touch. It was always there, woven into the fabric of everything, patient, unmarked, like a language no one had yet learned to read. I think about those early moments when a hand reached toward a doorknob in winter and felt that sudden spark, that tiny rebellion of the invisible, and how that small shock must have seemed like magic, because in a way it was the universe revealing something fundamental, something that had no name, no explanation, just a feeling, a tingle, a mystery wrapped in the ordinary. The ancient Greeks noticed it, too, in their own way. They would rub fossilized tree resin, amber, the color of honey and sunlight, and watch as it pulled small fragments of straw or feather toward itself, as if the amber had woken up, as if it had decided to reach out. They called the amber electron, and that word, soft and golden, would eventually give birth to the name we know today, though they could never have imagined what it would come to mean. In those early centuries, electricity was a whisper, a rumor among philosophers, something to wonder about in the margins of greater questions. It appeared in strange ocean creatures, the torpedo fish, the electric ray that could deliver a shock strong enough to numb a fisherman's arm. And people marveled and feared and tried to understand, but the tools did not yet exist. The framework was not yet built, and so the mystery remained, beautiful and untouchable. I picture those scholars in dim rooms lit by oil lamps, turning pieces of amber over in their hands, running silk across glass rods, watching feathers dance in the air, and writing careful notes about attraction, about invisible influence, about forces that seemed to defy the weight and solidity of the world they knew. They were mapping something they couldn't see, and they were doing it with patience, with the kind of attention that only comes when time moves slowly, when there is no urgency, only wonder. Centuries passed like that, with electricity living quietly in the background of human life, noticed occasionally in moments of static, in the glow of certain stones when struck together in the dark, in the summer storms that split the sky with light and sound. People saw these things, and they wove stories, and they built mythologies around the gods who threw lightning, because what else could explain such power, such sudden, breathtaking force? And then slowly, so slowly, the questions began to change. The wonder remained, but alongside it grew something else, a kind of systematic curiosity, a desire not just to observe, but to test, to repeat, to isolate, to understand the rules beneath the spectacle. This shift took generations. It required new instruments, new ways of thinking, new patience. But it was beginning, like the first light of dawn, barely visible, but unmistakable to those who were watching. I think about how different the world must have felt in those in-between centuries, when the old explanations were fading, but the new ones hadn't yet arrived, when electricity was still a mystery, still a wonder, but beginning, just beginning, to reveal its nature, to show that it could be coaxed, directed, studied, that it followed patterns, that it was not chaos, but order waiting to be discovered. The path from those early observations to the world we know today is long and winding and filled with moments of sudden insight and long stretches of patient, methodical work. It's a path that moves through centuries, across continents, through the minds of countless individuals who each added a piece, a fragment, a new way of seeing, until the invisible became visible, until the mystery became a tool, until the spark became the foundation of everything we touch. And so I begin there, in that quiet time before understanding, when electricity was still wild, still untamed, still waiting, because that's where every journey into knowledge begins, in the not knowing, in the space between the question and the answer, where everything is still possible, and the night is long, and the amber glows softly in the lamplight, pulling feathers toward itself, for reasons no one can yet name. The first person to truly study this invisible force with careful, deliberate attention was a man named William Gilbert, a physician to Queen Elizabeth I, living in England at the turn of the 17th century. He was not the first to notice the strange behavior of rubbed amber, but he was among the first to approach it with the mind of a scientist, with the patience of someone willing to test and test again, and record what he found. Gilbert spent years experimenting. He rubbed different materials together, amber and glass and sulfur, and he watched what they attracted. He discovered that many substances, not just amber, could be made to pull lightweight objects toward them after being rubbed, and he called these materials electrics, from that ancient Greek word, electron. He was giving a name to a category, creating a vocabulary where none had existed, and in doing so, he was building the foundation for everything that would follow. In 1600, Gilbert published his findings in a book called De Magnete, which means on the magnet, and though the book was primarily about magnetism, it contained those crucial observations about electricity, about this other invisible force that seemed related to magnetism, but different, distinct, operating by its own rules. The book spread slowly through Europe, copied by hand, discussed in universities, passed between curious minds who were beginning to see the world as something that could be understood, not just accepted. Time moved differently then. A discovery might take decades to travel from one country to another. An idea might sit dormant for a generation before someone picked it up again. There was no rush, no race, just a slow accumulation of knowledge, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, building up layer by patient layer. In 1660, a German inventor named Otto von Guericke created something remarkable. He built a machine, a sulfur globe that could be rotated and rubbed by hand. And when it spun, it generated static electricity, not just a little spark, but enough to create a visible glow in the darkness, enough to make a sound, a crackling like tiny thunder. This was the first electrical generator, crude and simple, but it was the beginning of something, the first time humans had created a sustained source of this mysterious force, had made it appear on demand. Von Guericke showed his machine to audiences, and they were amazed. They watched the globe glow in the dim light of evening, heard the crackle and snap, felt the tingle when they touched it, and they didn't fully understand what they were witnessing. But they knew it was important. They could feel it, the way you can feel the air change before a storm, that sense of something significant, something that would matter. Others began building similar machines, improving on the design, using glass instead of a sulfur, adding mechanisms to store the charge. Each improvement was small, incremental, but together they were building a toolkit, a set of instruments that would allow electricity to be studied, manipulated, understood. The invisible was becoming, if not visible, then at least tangible, something that could be worked with, shaped, directed. In the 1700s, the pace began to quicken just slightly. A French chemist named Charles-François de Cisternay Dufay discovered that there were two types of electricity. He rubbed different materials and found that sometimes they attracted each other, and sometimes they repelled. He called these two types vitreous and resinous, what we would later come to know as positive and negative charges. But he didn't know that yet. He just knew there were two, and that they behaved in opposite ways, like two sides of the same coin, like shadow and light. Around the same time, in the Netherlands, a professor named Peter van Musschenbroek was working with a glass jar, a simple container, partly filled with water, with a metal wire running through a cork in the top. He connected the wire to an electrical generator, and the jar began to store the charge, to hold it, like a vessel holding water. And when he touched the jar while it was charged, he received a shock so powerful it knocked him backward, so intense he later wrote that he wouldn't repeat the experiment for the Kingdom of France. This device became known as the Leyden jar, named after the city where it was developed, and it changed everything. Suddenly, electricity could be stored, accumulated, released all at once. It meant that experiments didn't have to happen in real time with a generator running. It meant the charge could be transported, shared, studied at leisure. The Leyden jar became the battery of its age, the first capacitor, and every laboratory that wanted to study electricity had to have one. I imagine those early experimenters working in their studies and workshops, surrounded by glass jars and spinning globes and metal chains, trying to understand the rules, the patterns. They would charge a jar, then touch it to different materials, seeing what conducted and what didn't. They would link jars together, creating larger and larger stores of electricity, and then discharge them all at once, creating sparks that jumped across gaps, that lit up the darkness, that made sounds like miniature lightning. And speaking of lightning, that was the great question of the age. The mystery that captured everyone's imagination. Was lightning the same as the electricity they were creating in their laboratories, or was it something else entirely? Something divine, something beyond human understanding? The question hung in the air, unanswered, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to test it. That person was Benjamin Franklin, a printer and writer and inventor living in Philadelphia, in the American colonies. He had read about the electrical experiments happening in Europe, and he had begun conducting his own. He noticed similarities between lightning and laboratory electricity, the way both created light, made sound, followed similar paths, struck high points, and he began to suspect they were the same thing, the same force, operating at vastly different scales. In 1752, Franklin performed his famous experiment. Though the details have been embellished over the years, he flew a kite in a thunderstorm, a kite with a metal wire attached to it, and at the end of the string, near where he stood, he attached a metal key. The idea was simple but dangerous. If lightning was electrical, it would travel down the wire, down the wet string, and he would be able to detect it at the key. The experiment worked. He saw sparks jumping from the key, felt the charge, and in that moment he proved what he had suspected. Lightning was electricity, the same force that made amber attract feathers, the same force that charged Leyden jars, but amplified, intensified, unleashed by nature with a power that dwarfed anything humans could create. The sky and the laboratory were connected. The divine and the mundane were one. Franklin's discovery was profound. It meant that this invisible force was everywhere, in everything, not just a curiosity, not just a parlor trick, but a fundamental aspect of the natural world, as basic as gravity, as essential as air. And if it was everywhere, if it followed rules, then perhaps it could be harnessed, used, put to work. Franklin invented the lightning rod, a simple metal pole placed at the highest point of a building, connected by wire to the ground. The idea was that lightning would strike the rod instead of the building, and the electricity would flow harmlessly into the earth. It was the first practical application of electrical knowledge, the first time humanity had used understanding of this force to protect itself, to work with nature rather than simply fear it. The lightning rod spread, slowly at first, then more rapidly, appearing on churches and government buildings, on homes and barns. Some people objected. They thought it was wrong to interfere with divine judgment, that lightning was God's will and shouldn't be redirected. But the rods worked, buildings stopped burning, lives were saved, and gradually resistance faded, replaced by acceptance, by the recognition that understanding nature didn't diminish its wonder. It just made it less deadly. Throughout the 1700s, more discoveries followed. More pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Scientists learned to distinguish between conductors and insulators, between materials that allowed electricity to flow freely and those that blocked it. They discovered that metals were excellent conductors, that glass and rubber and silk were insulators, and they used this knowledge to build better instruments, more precise experiments. In Italy, a professor named Luigi Galvani was dissecting frogs, as one did in the 18th century, and he noticed something strange. When he touched the frog's leg with two different metals at the same time, the leg would twitch, would move as if alive. Even though the frog was long dead, he believed he had discovered animal electricity, a special life force that existed in living tissue. But another Italian scientist, Alessandro Volta, disagreed. He believed the electricity was coming from the interaction of the two different metals, not from the frog. The frog was just responding, just conducting, but it wasn't the source. To prove his theory, Volta built a device, a stack of alternating zinc and copper discs, separated by cloth soaked in salt water, and when he touched wires to the top and bottom of the stack, he got a steady flow of electricity, continuous, reliable, not just a single shock like a Leyden jar, but a sustained current. This was the first true battery, invented in 1800, and it was revolutionary. For the first time, electricity could flow continuously, could be directed through wires, could power experiments for minutes or hours instead of just moments. Volta's pile, as it came to be known, opened doors that had been closed. It allowed scientists to study electrical current, to measure it, to understand how it moved and what it could do. The world was changing, imperceptibly at first, but changing nonetheless. These discoveries were happening in scattered locations in different countries, shared through letters and journals and occasional meetings, but they were building on each other, creating a foundation, a structure of understanding that would soon support something much larger, something that would transform not just science, but civilization itself. And still, in 1800, in the homes of ordinary people, none of this mattered yet. Life was still lit by candles and oil lamps. Power still came from muscle and water and wind. The discoveries were fascinating to scholars, but they hadn't yet touched the daily rhythm of human existence. They were seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting for the right conditions, the right minds, the right moment to burst into bloom. That moment came in the 1820s, when a Danish physicist named Hans Christian Ørsted was demonstrating electrical circuits to his students. He had a wire connected to a battery, and current was flowing through it, and nearby, purely by chance, there was a compass sitting on the table, and as the current flowed, the compass needle moved, twisted away from north, responding to something invisible emanating from the wire. Ørsted saw it and understood immediately what it meant. Electricity and magnetism were connected. They weren't just similar forces, they were intimately related, intertwined, two aspects of something deeper. This discovery rippled outward, reaching other scientists who seized upon it, who began exploring this relationship, probing its boundaries, testing its limits. In England, a man named Michael Faraday, who had started his life as a bookbinder's apprentice, who had taught himself science by reading the books he was supposed to be binding, took Ørsted's discovery and pushed it further. If electricity could create magnetism, could magnetism create electricity? Could the relationship flow both ways? Faraday was not a mathematician. He didn't work in equations. He worked with his hands, building apparatus, wrapping coils of wire around iron rings, moving magnets near conductors, feeling his way toward understanding, and in 1831 he discovered electromagnetic induction. He found that when he moved a magnet through a coil of wire, electricity flowed in the wire, not from a battery, not from a chemical reaction, but from motion, from the simple act of moving one thing near another. This was the principle that would power the world. The idea that motion could create electricity, that a turning wheel or a flowing river could be converted into this invisible current. It meant that electricity didn't have to come from batteries that would eventually run down. It could be generated continuously, endlessly, as long as something was moving. Faraday built the first primitive generator, a copper disc that rotated between the poles of a magnet, and as it spun, current flowed. It wasn't much, just a trickle, but it was proof. It was a door opening, and through that door lay everything, every light bulb, every motor, every humming wire that would eventually crisscross the planet. I imagine Faraday in his laboratory at the Royal Institution in London, surrounded by coils and magnets and jars of chemicals, his notebook open, recording every observation, every variation. He wasn't trying to build something practical, not yet. He was trying to understand, to see the invisible patterns, to trace the lines of force that he believed filled all of space, connecting everything to everything else. While Faraday was experimenting, other minds were working on the mathematical foundation. In Scotland, James Clerk Maxwell was developing equations that would describe electricity and magnetism as unified phenomena, waves propagating through space. He showed that light itself was an electromagnetic wave, that the visible spectrum was just a small slice of a much larger reality, that radio waves and X-rays and all the invisible radiation that fills the universe were all the same thing, electricity and magnetism dancing together, creating ripples in the fabric of space. But equations and theories, however beautiful, don't light homes or power machines. For that, electricity needed to become practical, usable, cheap enough and safe enough to leave the laboratory and enter the world. The first practical applications were in telegraphy. Samuel Morse in America and Charles Wheatstone in England developed systems that could send messages over wires, dots and dashes, pulses of electricity representing letters, and suddenly, for the first time in human history, information could travel faster than a horse could run, faster than a ship could sail. Messages that would have taken weeks to deliver now arrived in minutes. Telegraph wires began stretching across continents, under oceans, connecting cities and countries. The world was shrinking, time was compressing, and electricity was the force making it possible. But telegraphy was just the beginning, just a hint of what was coming. In the 1870s and 80s, the race to create electric light began in earnest. Dozens of inventors worked on the problem, trying to find a material that would glow when electricity passed through it, that would glow brightly, steadily, without burning up too quickly. The challenge was finding the right filament, the right material to put inside a glass bulb to heat until it glowed like a tiny sun. Thomas Edison in America, Joseph Swan in England. Both arrived at similar solutions around the same time. A carbon filament sealed in a glass bulb with the air removed could glow for hours, for days, providing steady, clean light without flame, without smoke, without the constant need for fuel, Edison built his first successful bulb in 1879, and he knew immediately that this was more than an invention. It was the beginning of a transformation, but a light bulb by itself was useless. It needed electricity to flow to it, continuously, reliably, and that meant building an entire system, generators to create the power, wires to carry it, switches to control it, meters to measure it. Edison understood this. He wasn't just inventing a product, he was inventing an infrastructure, a network, a new way of organizing energy and space. In 1882, Edison opened the first commercial power station on Pearl Street in New York City. It had 6 generators powered by coal-fired steam engines, and they fed electricity through underground cables to 59 customers in the surrounding blocks. The system used direct current, electricity flowing in one direction, like water through a pipe, and it worked. Lights came on in offices and homes, steady and bright, and people gathered to watch, to marvel at this new thing that seemed like magic, but was really just understanding, applied with patience and precision. The early power stations were small, serving just a few blocks, because direct current couldn't travel far without losing strength. The voltage would drop over distance, and so every neighborhood needed its own generator, its own coal pile, its own engine house with men shoveling fuel day and night. It was practical, but limited, constrained by the physics of how electricity moved through wires. In Europe, another inventor was thinking about this problem differently. Nikola Tesla, a Serbian engineer working in France and then America, believed that alternating current electricity that reversed direction many times per second could solve the distance problem. Alternating current could be stepped up to very high voltages for transmission, then stepped down again for use. And high voltage meant less loss over long distances, meant one generator could serve an entire city or more. Tesla designed motors and generators for alternating current, elegant machines that took advantage of the reversing flow, and he tried to convince Edison to switch systems. But Edison had invested too much in direct current, had built too much infrastructure, had made too many promises. The two men and the companies behind them went to war, not with weapons, but with demonstrations and publicity, each trying to prove their system was superior, safer, more practical. The battle was fierce, public, sometimes ugly. Edison held demonstrations where he electrocuted animals with alternating current, trying to show it was dangerous. Tesla and his backer, George Westinghouse, built power stations and long-distance transmission lines, proving the system could work, could do things direct current never could. The struggle lasted years, filled newspapers, captured the public imagination. In the end, physics won. Alternating current could simply do more, could travel farther, could power larger areas from fewer stations. In 1893, Westinghouse won the contract to light the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and when those lights came on, hundreds of thousands of them illuminating buildings and fountains and pathways, turning night into day across the fairgrounds, the world saw what electricity could be, what it could do, and the future was decided. That same year, work began on harnessing Niagara Falls, building generators that would convert the endless flow of water into electricity, and sending that power to Buffalo, 20 miles away. It was a project that seemed impossible, audacious, but it worked. The generator spun, the power flowed, and for the first time, A major city was lit by electricity generated far away, by the raw force of nature captured and transformed. I think about what it must have been like to live through that transition, to remember when night was dark, truly dark, when the only light after sunset came from flames, and then to see streets lit by electricity, steady and bright and always there, to flip a switch and have light appear, instant, reliable, like sunrise on demand. The changes came faster after that. Electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn ones, cleaner, faster, not limited by how tired the animals were. Electric elevators made tall buildings practical, allowing cities to grow upward instead of just outward. Electric motors began appearing in factories, each machine with its own motor, instead of all being connected to a single steam engine by belts and pulleys. Workers could arrange equipment for efficiency instead of just proximity to the power source. Homes began to change too, slowly at first. Electric irons, electric fans, electric stoves and heaters. Each new device was expensive, a luxury, but as more people bought them, as production scaled up, prices fell, and what was once available only to the wealthy became ordinary, expected. The electric grid spread, reaching smaller towns, rural areas, climbing up poles along country roads, bringing light and power to farmhouses that had never known anything but lanterns. By the early 1900s, electricity was becoming fundamental, not just a novelty, but a necessity. Cities were rewiring themselves. New buildings were designed around electrical systems from the start. Old ones were retrofitted, walls opened, wires threaded through. Electrician became a profession, a skilled trade, and linemen climbed poles to string wire after wire, connecting homes and factories and offices into a growing web of power. The light bulb evolved, became more efficient. Tungsten filaments replaced carbon, lasting longer, burning brighter. Glass manufacturing improved, making bulbs cheaper, more uniform. And with better bulbs came new uses: street lights, car headlights, flashlights, surgical lamps. Every problem that had once been solved with flame was being reconsidered, reimagined, improved. And electricity was doing more than just making light. It was enabling communication on scales never before possible. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, used electricity to carry voices across wires. At first, just across a room, then across a city, then across continents. Switchboards staffed by operators connected call after call, voices traveling as electrical signals, converted to sound at the other end. People could speak to each other across impossible distances, could share news, conduct business, maintain relationships that distance would once have severed. Radio came next. Guglielmo Marconi and others learning to send signals through the air itself, no wires needed, just electromagnetic waves propagating through space, exactly as Maxwell had predicted. By the 1920s, radio stations were broadcasting, voices and music reaching into homes, creating shared experiences, connecting scattered communities into something larger. The invisible spectrum was becoming a highway, carrying information, entertainment, news, all powered by electricity, all moving at the speed of light. The 1920s and 30s brought electricity fully into the mainstream of life, no longer a marvel to demonstrate, but a utility to depend on. So power plants grew larger, more efficient, burning coal or oil, or harnessing falling water, spinning massive generators day and night, feeding an ever-hungry grid that stretched farther each year, reaching into valleys and across plains, climbing mountains, crossing deserts. Rural electrification became a mission, a project. In America, the Tennessee Valley Authority built dams and power stations, strung thousands of miles of wire, bringing electricity to regions that had been left behind in the first wave of development. Farms that had relied on muscle and sunlight suddenly had power tools, electric pumps for wells, lights in barns, refrigerators to keep food fresh. The transformation was profound, reshaping not just work but culture, possibility, the sense of what life could be. Electric refrigeration changed how people ate. Before, food preservation meant smoking, salting, canning, or eating quickly before spoilage. Ice boxes required ice delivered by men who cut it from frozen lakes in winter and stored it in sawdust. But electric refrigerators kept food cold continuously, reliably, expanding what could be stored, what could be cooked, what could be planned. Kitchens became different places, equipped with electric stoves and mixers and eventually dishwashers, each appliance reducing the hours of labor that had once defined domestic life. Air conditioning arrived, first in theaters and department stores, then in office buildings, gradually in homes. It used electricity to move heat, to make indoor spaces cool even when outside the summer blazed. This changed where people could live comfortably, changed architecture, changed cities in the American South and Southwest. Places that had been seasonal or sleepy became year-round, vibrant, powered by the ability to control climate, to make anywhere temperate. World War II accelerated everything. The demands of war required massive industrial production, aircraft factories, shipyards, munitions plants, all running around the clock, all consuming electricity at rates that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. New power stations were built in months instead of years. Aluminum production, essential for aircraft, required enormous amounts of electricity, and dams were built specifically to supply it. The war proved that electricity could be scaled, could support civilization at its most intense, its most demanding. And during the war, a new use for electricity emerged, one that would eventually rival even lighting in its impact. The first electronic computers were built, massive machines filling entire rooms, using thousands of vacuum tubes that glowed with heat and light, consuming kilowatts of power to perform calculations. These early computers were built to crack codes, to calculate artillery trajectories, to solve problems too complex for human minds working alone. After the war, the computers didn't disappear. They evolved, improved. Vacuum tubes gave way to transistors, solid-state devices that did the same work with less power, less heat, less space. Transistors gave way to integrated circuits, chips containing thousands, then millions, then billions of tiny switches, all controlling the flow of electricity at scales so small they approach the atomic. And through all these changes, electricity remained fundamental, the force that moved through the circuits, that represented information, that made computation possible. The second half of the 20th century saw electricity become so thoroughly woven into daily life that its presence became invisible, taken for granted. People stopped thinking about it except when it failed, when a storm knocked down lines or a transformer blew, and suddenly the silence was deafening. The hum that had become the background of civilization stopped, And in that silence, people remembered how dependent they had become, how much they relied on this invisible flow of energy. Cities at night became landscapes of light, streets illuminated, buildings glowing, signs flashing. From above, from an airplane or a satellite, the lights traced the shapes of human settlement, bright clusters connected by luminous threads. The nighttime Earth became a mirror of the daytime, not dark anymore, but alive with artificial suns, billions of light bulbs and fluorescent tubes and later LEDs, all drawing current from the grid, all pushing back the darkness that had defined night since the beginning of time. Nuclear power emerged, a new way to generate electricity, splitting atoms instead of burning coal, using the heat from controlled fission to boil water, to spin turbines, to turn generators. The first commercial nuclear power plant opened in 1957 in Pennsylvania, and others followed. Each one could produce enormous amounts of power without smoke, without the mountains of coal or rivers of oil that conventional plants required. Though the technology brought its own challenges, its own fears and careful regulations, it proved that electricity could come from the very structure of matter itself. From Einstein's famous equation made practical, solar panels appeared, devices that converted sunlight directly into electricity, using the photoelectric effect that Einstein had explained decades earlier. At first they were expensive, inefficient, used mainly in space where the advantages outweighed the cost. But gradually, year by year, they improved, became cheaper, more practical. People began putting them on roofs, in fields, in deserts, harvesting light, turning photons into current, closing a circle that stretched back to the sun, the ultimate source of nearly all energy on Earth. Wind turbines grew, evolved from small farm windmills into massive structures with blades longer than airplanes, standing in fields and offshore, turning steadily in the breeze. Their generators spun in the wind, producing electricity that fed into the grid alongside power from coal and gas and nuclear. The mix was changing, diversifying, moving towards sources that could be sustained indefinitely. That didn't depend on ancient carbon pulled from the ground. Through all this growth, all this evolution, the fundamental nature of electricity remained what Faraday and Maxwell had discovered, what Edison and Tesla had harnessed: electrons flowing through conductors, moving in response to voltage, creating magnetic fields, doing work. The physics hadn't changed, but humanity's ability to use them, to channel them, to build civilization around them, had grown beyond anything those early experimenters could have imagined. I think about the scale of it now. The global grid, not truly connected everywhere, but vast nonetheless. Generating stations by the thousands, transmission lines strung across continents, substations stepping voltage up and down, transformers on poles, wires running to every building, circuits behind every wall, electricity flowing constantly, invisibly, supporting everything, every computer, every light, every motor, every heater and cooler and communicator, all drawing from the same fundamental force that made amber attract feathers in ancient Greece. The internet arrived, computers connecting to computers, first in universities and government, then spreading, becoming commercial, becoming personal. Each connection required electricity, servers in climate-controlled rooms, routers directing traffic, fiber optic cables carrying light instead of electrons, but still requiring power to generate and detect that light. The digital world, the virtual spaces where so much of modern life happens, all of it runs on electricity. All of it would vanish instantly and completely. If the power stopped, mobile phones emerged, small computers that fit in a pocket, connected wirelessly to networks, to the internet, to each other. Each one contains a battery, a descendant of Volta's pile, storing electricity chemically and releasing it on demand. They charge from the grid, drawing power overnight or throughout the day, converting alternating current to direct, stepping voltage down, filling the battery so the device can run for hours, for days, before needing to connect again. Electric vehicles began to appear, first as experiments, then as products. Cars powered by batteries instead of gasoline, motors instead of engines. They represented a return to the early days of automobiles, when electric cars briefly competed with internal combustion, before the limitations of battery technology made them impractical. But a century of improvement in batteries, in motors, in power electronics, made them viable again, practical, increasingly common. The same grid that lit homes could now power transportation, could replace the burning of fuel with the flow of electrons. And still, underneath all the applications, all the devices and systems and networks, the basic reality remained simple. Electricity is the movement of charge, the flow of electrons through conductors, responding to voltage, creating effects. It can be generated by motion, by chemical reactions, by light, by heat. It can be stored, transmitted, transformed, used to create light or motion or heat or information. It follows laws that were discovered and described in the 19th century, laws that still hold, that still explain everything from the smallest circuit to the largest power grid. The story of electricity is the story of understanding, of taking something mysterious and invisible and learning its rules, its patterns, its possibilities. It's the story of patient observation, careful experiment, mathematical description, and then, crucially, practical application. The gap between knowing how something works and building useful things with that knowledge is vast, and crossing it required not just scientists, but engineers, entrepreneurs, electricians, linemen, regulators, investors, millions of people, each contributing a piece, each adding to what came before. As I trace this history from amber and wool to the electric world we inhabit now, I'm struck by the continuity, the way each discovery built on previous ones, the way understanding deepened gradually, layer upon layer. No single person invented electricity or discovered all its properties. It was revealed slowly, through the work of many minds across many generations, each seeing a bit further, each adding to the collective knowledge, until the invisible became visible, until the mysterious became mundane, until the force that once seemed magical became the foundation of everything. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing, not that electricity powers our world, but that we learn to understand it at all, that we mapped the invisible, that we found the patterns in phenomena that our ancestors could only wonder at. That journey from mystery to mastery took centuries, required brilliance and persistence and countless failures, but it happened step by patient step, spark by tiny spark, until the darkness retreated and the modern world emerged, humming with current, alive with light. The deeper I move into this story, the more I realize that electricity is not just about power or light or convenience. It's about revealing the invisible architecture of reality, about discovering that the world operates according to rules we can learn, patterns we can predict, forces we can work with rather than simply endure. Before electricity was understood, the universe seemed more arbitrary, more capricious. Lightning struck without warning or reason. Sparks appeared mysteriously when wool touched amber. The northern lights danced in the sky with no explanation. These phenomena existed in the realm of wonder, of mythology, of divine intervention. But as people began to study them, to test and measure and theorize, the wonder didn't disappear. It transformed into something else, a different kind of awe, the recognition that nature follows laws, elegant and consistent, waiting to be discovered. There's something profound about the fact that the same force powers a thunderstorm and a light bulb, that the electricity in your nervous system, the signals moving from brain to muscle, from sense to thought, is fundamentally the same as the electricity in the wires behind your walls. It's all electrons, all charge in motion, all following the same principles that Maxwell described in his equations. The universe is unified in ways that aren't immediately obvious, and electricity was one of the first windows into that unity. I think about how electricity changed our relationship with time. Before artificial light, human activity followed the sun. Work happened during daylight. Evening was for rest or simple tasks by firelight. The rhythm of life was tied to the rotation of the earth in ways it had been since consciousness began. But electric light broke that connection, made night into day, allowed work and activity and thought to continue regardless of the sun's position. Factories could run 3 shifts. Cities could stay awake. The circadian rhythms that had governed humanity for millennia suddenly faced competition from human-made light, constant and controllable. This wasn't entirely good, wasn't entirely progress without cost. We've learned that constant light disrupts sleep, confuses the biological systems that expect darkness, that need it, but it happened, and it can't be undone. The electric world doesn't turn off, doesn't sleep. It hums through the night, powering streetlights and hospitals and data centers, maintaining the infrastructure of connection and commerce that never pauses. And electricity enabled a kind of precision that wasn't possible before. When power came from water wheels or windmills or steam engines, it was variable, dependent on conditions, but electricity can be controlled with exquisite accuracy, voltage regulated to within millivolts, current adjusted in microseconds. This precision made possible everything from medical equipment to semiconductor manufacturing to the timing systems that keep the internet synchronized. Without the fine control that electricity allows, the modern world's complexity couldn't exist, couldn't function. There's also something worth considering about how invisible it all is. Most people use electricity constantly without thinking about where it comes from, how it's generated, how it reaches them. They flip switches, plug in devices, expect light and power and connection, and receive them, the infrastructure that makes this possible. The generating stations and transmission lines and transformers and substations, most of it is out of sight, taken for granted, noticed only when it fails. This invisibility is both a triumph and a vulnerability. A triumph because it means the system works so well, so reliably, that it fades into the background. becomes as expected as air or gravity, but a vulnerability because invisible systems are fragile systems. People don't protect or maintain or understand things they can't see, and the grid, for all its redundancy and robustness, is still susceptible to storms, to equipment failure, to the simple wear of time. We've built a civilization that depends entirely on something most people don't understand, can't see, can only trust, will keep flowing. Yet perhaps that trust is justified. The electrical grid is one of humanity's greatest collective achievements, a system that requires cooperation across jurisdictions and companies and countries, that requires constant maintenance and upgrading and balancing, that works because thousands of people, engineers and technicians and planners, make it work every day, every hour, adjusting loads and routing power and fixing problems before most people know they exist. And the story continues, still unfolding. Solar panels become cheaper, more efficient. Wind turbines grow larger, more capable. Battery technology improves, able to store more energy, discharge it more reliably. The grid is transforming again, becoming more distributed, less dependent on massive centralized plants, more resilient, more sustainable. The next chapter is being written now by engineers and scientists working on problems their predecessors couldn't have imagined, using tools that wouldn't exist without electricity to solve challenges about electricity itself. There's a poetry to it, a circularity. We use electricity to understand electricity, to improve the systems that generate and distribute it, to create the computers that model better batteries, better solar cells, better ways to manage the complexity of a grid that connects millions of sources and consumers. The tool has become both the means and the object, both the question and the answer. As I consider the long arc of this story, from Gilbert's experiments with amber to the global grid that powers billions of devices, I'm aware of how much had to align, how many minds had to be curious in the right ways, how many experiments had to succeed or fail in useful ways, how many practical problems had to be solved. The path from discovery to application is never straight, never simple. It requires not just understanding but engineering, not just knowledge but infrastructure, not just invention but adoption. And yet it happened relatively quickly in the scope of human history. A person born in 1850 might have lived by candlelight as a child and died in a home with electric lights and a telephone and a radio, might have witnessed the entire transformation from mystery to utility, from wonder to mundane necessity. How strange that must have been, to watch the world change so fundamentally, to experience the before and after of a revolution that touched everything. Now the change continues, but differently. We're not discovering electricity anymore. We're refining our use of it, making it cleaner, more efficient, more ubiquitous. We're putting it in new places, new devices, finding new applications for the same fundamental force. The physics is settled, the mystery is solved, but the possibilities keep expanding, keep surprising us with what else can be done, what else can be built, what else can be imagined and then made real. And in all of this, in the complexity and the infrastructure and the applications, the basic wonder remains if we choose to see it, that moving a magnet near a wire creates current, that light and radio waves are the same phenomenon, that the spark you feel touching a doorknob is the same force that lights cities and powers computers and connects the world. These facts, established and certain, are still remarkable, still worthy of attention, still beautiful in their simplicity and their implications. The story of electricity is ultimately a story about human capacity, about our ability to observe, to question, to test, to understand, to build, to transform knowledge into power, into light, into connection. It's a story that isn't finished, that continues in laboratories and power plants and homes, in every device that draws current, in every wire carrying charge from place to place, in every mind still curious about how things work and how they might work better. And so I find myself here at the end of this long contemplation, having traced the arc from ancient amber to the electric present, from mystery to mastery, from darkness to perpetual light. The story could continue, could branch into 1,000 tributaries, each interesting, each worthy of exploration. But perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the outline is clear. Electricity is everywhere now, in everything. It's in the device displaying these words, in the networks that transmitted them, in the lights illuminating the room, in the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, in the car waiting to be charged, in the phone in your pocket, in the infrastructure underlying civilization, invisible but essential, taken for granted but remarkable. I think about those early experimenters, Franklin with his kite, Faraday with his coils, Maxwell with his equations. They were trying to understand something invisible, something that couldn't be seen or held, only felt, only inferred from its effects. And they succeeded. They mapped the territory. They found the rules. They gave us the knowledge that others would build upon, would transform into the electric world we inhabit. And that world keeps changing, keeps evolving. The next generation will tell their own stories about electricity, about new ways to generate it, store it, use it. They'll solve problems we haven't fully recognized yet. They'll make improvements we can only imagine. But they'll build on the same foundation, the same understanding, the same fundamental physics that was discovered in laboratories centuries ago by people who were simply curious, who wanted to know why amber attracted feathers, why lightning struck, what this invisible force might be. The circle completes itself in a way. We began with wonder, with mystery, with things unexplained. And now, having explained so much, having harnessed and controlled and built with electricity, we can return to wonder, can choose to see the remarkable in the everyday, can appreciate that the light above you, the device in your hand, the world you move through, all of it depends on something discovered piece by piece, understood gradually, applied patiently by people who came before, who asked questions and sought answers and shared what they learned. As this story draws to a close, as the words slow and the thoughts settle, I'm left with a simple appreciation for the invisible forces that shape our world, for the human capacity to understand them, for the long, slow accumulation of knowledge that brought us from darkness to light, from isolation to connection, from mystery to not certainty exactly, but understanding, workable understanding, sufficient to build a world, sufficient to power civilization, sufficient to illuminate the night. The electrons keep flowing through wires and circuits and devices, doing their work, moving in response to voltage, following paths laid down by engineers, carrying power and information and possibility. They've been flowing since the first generators spun, since the first batteries discharged, and they'll keep flowing, invisible and essential. The current beneath everything, the force we learn to harness, the light we learn to summon, the connection we learn to maintain. And perhaps that's where the story rests. Not ending, but simply pausing, acknowledging that electricity is not a conclusion, but a continuation, not a destination, but a journey still underway, still revealing new facets, still supporting new dreams, still humming quietly in the background, powering the world, lighting the darkness, connecting the scattered, making possible everything we've built, everything we've become, everything we might yet be. The lights glow softly, the current flows steadily, and the night, once so dark, is filled with illumination, with connection, with the gentle hum of civilization powered by understanding, by curiosity, by the long, slow, patient work of discovery us. And in that soft glow, in that steady hum, the story continues quiet and constant, invisible but everywhere, as fundamental as breath, as present as light, as essential as the current that flows endlessly through everything. There is something about the way light falls across a canvas, something about the stillness of a studio in the early hours, when the world outside has not yet begun to move. And inside these quiet rooms, painters once stood before their easels, brushes poised, contemplating color and shadow and the infinite possibilities of what might emerge from nothing more than pigment and linseed oil. I find myself walking through the 19th century tonight, not as it existed in the rush of industry and empire, but as it lived in the studios of those who devoted themselves to capturing it, frame by frame, stroke by stroke, building entire worlds with their hands. The air in these imagined spaces feels different somehow, thick with the scent of turpentine and beeswax, dust motes suspended in shafts of northern light streaming through tall windows, the kind of light that painters prized above all else, steady and cool and unchanging throughout the long hours of work. I can almost see the worn floorboards, paint spattered and uneven, the tables cluttered with tubes of color squeezed and twisted, their metal bodies bearing the marks of countless applications, ochre and umber and vermilion and cobalt, names that sound like poetry when spoken slowly, each one a gateway to a different quality of seeing. These painters, these remarkable individuals who lived between 1790 and 1900, they witnessed a world transforming at unprecedented speed, railways cutting through countryside that had remained unchanged for centuries, cities swelling beyond recognition, photography emerging to challenge everything painting had been. And yet they continued day after day, returning to their canvases with a kind of devotion that borders on the sacred. There were so many of them, each with their own vision, their own understanding of what it meant to translate the visible world into something that could live forever on a flat surface. Some worked in sun-drenched fields, others in cluttered Parisian apartments, still others in grand ateliers where students gathered to learn the old techniques, the traditional methods passed down through generations. Tonight I want to walk among them, to move slowly through their world, to understand not just what they painted, but how they saw, what drew their eye, what made them choose one shade of green over another, one angle of light instead of the next. Because in these choices, in these thousands upon thousands of small decisions, entire philosophies of beauty were born. The century itself seems to unfold like a long gallery, room after room of different approaches, different schools of thought, beginning with those who painted in the grand manner, the history painters and portraitists who commanded enormous canvases and royal commissions, their work lit by candlelight in the salons of Europe, admired by crowds who came to see art that told stories, that elevated and educated and impressed. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. Painters started turning away from mythology and biblical scenes. They began looking instead at the world immediately around them, the ordinary made extraordinary through attention, through care, through the simple act of seeing what had always been there, but had somehow remained invisible. I think of the light in their studios again, how it must have changed throughout the day. Morning brightness giving way to afternoon's golden warmth, then evening's violet shadows, and how a painter working on the same canvas across weeks or months would have seen it transform under these different conditions, would have had to make choices about which light was the truest, which version of reality to preserve. There is something profound in this, in the way these artists devoted entire lifetimes to the problem of representation, to the question of how to make paint on canvas feel alive, feel true, feel like more than just colored mud spread across woven fabric. And so I begin this slow journey, this unhurried exploration of their world, knowing that each painter I encounter will offer a different answer to the same fundamental questions. What is worth painting? How should it be painted? And what can art reveal that we might otherwise miss in the blur of simply living? The 19th century awaits, vast and varied, filled with more beauty and innovation than any single telling could capture. But here in this quiet space, with time moving at its own gentle pace, perhaps we can glimpse something of what these remarkable individuals saw and understood, and gave to us through their patient, persistent, transformative work. The century opens with painters still working in the long shadow of the past, still looking to Rome and Athens for their subjects, still believing that the highest calling of art was to depict gods and heroes, moments of classical virtue frozen in time, rendered with the precision and clarity that academies across Europe demanded of their students. In France, in those early years after the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David commanded enormous influence, his studio in Paris a place where young artists gathered to learn the principles of neoclassicism, that style which prized order above all else, rational composition, clear lines, subjects drawn from history and mythology, everything calculated to inspire civic virtue and moral certainty. David's canvases from this period possess a kind of theatrical clarity, every figure positioned with geometric precision, every fold of cloth arranged to suggest marble sculpture, the colors cool and controlled, nothing left to chance or spontaneity. And his students absorbed these lessons, carried them forward into the new century, believing as he did that art should elevate and instruct, should stand apart from the messiness of everyday life. But even then, even in those opening years when neoclassicism seemed unassailable, other possibilities were stirring, other ways of seeing beginning to emerge in studios across Europe. In Spain, Francisco Goya worked in a register entirely his own, court painter to kings and witness to war. His early works displayed the technical brilliance expected of a royal portraitist. But something darker moved beneath those surfaces, something that would eventually burst forth in images of violence and nightmare, visions that seemed to come from some place the academies never acknowledged. Goya's portraits from the 1790s capture Spanish aristocracy with unflinching honesty. He painted the royal family in 1800, and while the composition follows traditional formulas, there is something unsettling in how he renders their faces, a psychological penetration that borders on cruel, as if he sees past the costumes and jewels to something more troubling underneath. And when war came to Spain, when Napoleon's forces invaded and the country descended into brutal conflict, Goya responded with images that shattered every convention about how violence should be depicted. His disasters of war etchings show bodies broken and piled, faces contorted in agony, scenes rendered with stark economy, no classical nobility, no redemptive meaning, just the terrible weight of what humans do to each other. This was painting moving toward something new, toward a willingness to confront subjects the academies preferred to ignore, toward an art that could contain darkness as well as light, chaos as well as order. In England, Joseph Mallord William Turner was beginning his own revolution, though it would unfold more gradually. His early works displayed the topographical precision expected of landscape painting in that era, ruins and abbeys rendered with architectural accuracy, compositions balanced according to established principles, everything the Royal Academy recognized as proper and accomplished. But Turner was obsessed with light, with atmosphere, with the way weather could transform a scene from moment to moment. And as the years progressed, as he gained hushed confidence and reputation, his paintings began to dissolve, solid forms giving way to veils of color and mist, the world reimagined as pure luminosity. By 1812, by 1815, Turner's canvases were becoming increasingly radical. His Hannibal crossing the Alps depicts the ancient general's army almost consumed by a vortex of storm, the historical subject merely an excuse to explore the overwhelming power of natural forces, tiny figures dwarfed by swirling darkness and bursts of light. Critics didn't always know what to make of these works. Some praised their ambition, while others complained they looked unfinished, sketchy, as if Turner had stopped before the painting was complete. But he was after something they couldn't quite grasp, not the imitation of nature, but the sensation of it, the feeling of standing before vastness, of being surrounded by weather and light in constant transformation. Across the Channel, in Germany, Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes of an entirely different character, where Turner pursued movement and dissolution. Friedrich created images of profound stillness, lone figures standing before mountains or ruined abbeys or endless seas, their backs turned to the viewer, gazing into distances we can only imagine. These paintings from the 1810s and 1820s operate as spiritual meditations. The natural world becomes a space for contemplation, for measuring human smallness against the infinite. Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog shows a man on a rocky peak, looking out over layers of mist-shrouded mountains. We see what he sees, but can never fully know his thoughts. His inner experience remains private, mysterious. There is something deeply romantic in this, in the way Friedrich's landscapes make room for solitude and introspection, for the sublime emotions that wild nature can provoke, terror and awe, and a kind of religious reverence that needs no church, just mountains and sky and the overwhelming sense of something greater than ourselves. In France, Theodore Géricault was pushing history painting toward contemporary tragedy. His massive canvas, The Raft of the Medusa, depicted a recent shipwreck, survivors stranded on a makeshift raft, bodies piled in various states of life and death, the composition pyramidal like classical art, but the subject matter visceral and immediate and deeply disturbing. Géricault researched this painting with obsessive thoroughness. He interviewed survivors, visited morgues to study dead bodies, built a scale model of the raft. He wanted accuracy not for its own sake, but to make the horror feel real, to create a history painting about the present moment, about actual suffering rather than mythological allegory. The painting caused a sensation when exhibited in 1819. Some viewers found it too graphic, too political in its implicit critique of French naval incompetence. But Géricault had demonstrated that large-scale painting could address contemporary events, could find grandeur and meaning in recent tragedy rather than ancient myth. Eugène Delacroix absorbed these lessons and carried them further. His The Massacre at Chios depicted Greeks suffering under Ottoman violence. His Liberty Leading the People transformed the July Revolution of 1830 into an allegorical vision, a bare-breasted liberty striding over barricades, tricolor flag raised high, bodies of the fallen scattered beneath her feet. These were romantic paintings in the fullest sense, privileging emotion over reason, color over line, movement over stasis. Delacroix's brushwork was loose and energetic, his compositions dynamic rather than static, everything designed to provoke feeling, to sweep the viewer into the drama unfolding on canvas. The academies resisted this new direction. They still taught that drawing was superior to color, that composition should be carefully planned rather than improvised, that noble subjects demanded noble treatment, restrained and dignified. But the romantic painters were after something else. They wanted passion, intensity. They wanted art that could match the tumultuous character of their age. In England, John Constable was revolutionizing landscape, painting through obsessive attention to specific places, to the fields and streams and skies of his native Suffolk. He painted the same locations again and again, studying how light changed across seasons, how clouds built and dispersed, how water reflected the sky's moods. Constable's technique involved building up surfaces with thick applications of paint, sometimes using a palette knife to create texture. His skies were full of movement, masses of white and gray clouds suggesting weight and moisture. He wanted his landscapes to feel alive, to capture the freshness of direct observation rather than the stale formulas of studio composition. When his paintings were exhibited in Paris in the 1820s, they influenced a generation of French painters. That directness of approach, that willingness to make nature itself the subject without mythological pretense, it suggested possibilities that would flower in the decades to come. And in those same years, in rural France, in the village of Barbizon near the forest of Fontainebleau, painters were beginning to gather, drawn by the ancient woods and agricultural landscapes, seeking to paint nature directly, without classical embellishment, without the idealizing conventions the academies promoted. Théodore Rousseau, Jean-François Millet, Charles-François d'Aubigny, these artists of the Barbizon school worked outdoors, making studies from life, then completing larger canvases in their studios. They painted peasants working the land, forest interiors dappled with light, twilight scenes of cattle returning home, ordinary subjects treated with deep seriousness. Millets, the Gleaners, shows 3 women bent over a harvested field, gathering leftover grain, their bodies forming a rhythmic pattern of labor. The horizon line high so we see them against vast expanses of wheat stubble. It is a painting about work, about poverty, about the dignity of rural life, presented without sentimentality or condescension. This was painting moving steadily toward realism, toward a conviction that contemporary life, even in its most humble manifestations, deserved the attention once reserved for gods and saints. The shift was gradual but inexorable, the century turning away from classical idealism, turning toward the world as it actually appeared, in all its beauty and harshness, its poetry and its plainness. The 1850s arrive, and with them a new assertiveness about what painting could be, about what deserved to be seen and celebrated on canvas. Gustave Courbet declared himself a realist, and meant it as a challenge, a rejection of everything the Salon and the Academy held sacred. No more gods, no more allegories, only the visible world rendered with unflinching honesty. Courbet's The Stone Breakers depicted 2 laborers, an old man and a young boy, breaking rocks by the roadside, their faces turned away, their bodies bent to thankless work. He painted them life-size, the scale traditionally reserved for historical or religious subjects, and in doing so he made a radical argument that these anonymous workers were as worthy of monumental treatment as any emperor or saint. The painting scandalized many viewers, not because of its technique, which was robust and confident, but because of its subject matter, because Courbet refused to beautify poverty or make labor picturesque. He showed it as it was, brutal and grinding and ordinary, the kind of scene people passed on country roads without a second thought, now impossible to ignore. His studio in Ornans became a kind of a headquarters for this new realism. He painted himself there in the painter's studio, a massive canvas showing the artist at his easel, surrounded by various figures, models, and patrons and friends. The painting subtitled A Real Allegory, that paradoxical phrase capturing something essential about what he was attempting, to make the real world allegorical simply by attending to it with sufficient seriousness. In Paris, in these same years, Edouard Manet was beginning his own campaign against academic conventions, though his methods were more subtle, more rooted in the language of the old masters, even as he transformed it into something shockingly new. Manet studied the Spanish painters at the Louvre, Velázquez especially, absorbing their bold contrasts of light and dark, their flattened pictorial corporeal space, their refusal of unnecessary detail, and he brought these lessons to contemporary Parisian subjects. Café scenes and parks and boulevards, the modern city as it actually looked in the 1860s. Olympia caused an uproar at the Salon of 1865. The painting depicted a nude woman, a prostitute, clearly, reclining on white sheets, meeting the viewer's gaze with cool directness, a black servant bringing flowers, presumably from a client. Everything rendered with shocking plainness, no mythological alibi, no softening of the transaction being implied. The pose referenced Titian's Venus of Urbino, that Renaissance masterpiece of idealized beauty, but where Titian's Venus embodied timeless femininity, Manet's Olympia was entirely of her moment, a working woman in modern Paris her body pale against dark surroundings, painted with broad, flat areas of color rather than the subtle modeling academic technique demanded. Critics attacked the painting viciously. They called it vulgar, ugly, unfinished. They objected to the way Manet had painted her skin without conventional shading, without the smooth transitions that made flesh look soft and inviting. But Manet was after a different kind of truth, not idealization but observation, not fantasy but fact. His luncheon on the grass had provoked similar outrage 2 years earlier, showing a nude woman sitting casually with 2 fully dressed men in a park, another woman bathing in the background, the spatial relationships deliberately flattened, the whole scene painted with that same bold simplification that made everything feel both immediate and strangely artificial. These paintings announced that modern life demanded modern techniques, that the old methods of smooth finish and illusionistic depth were inadequate for capturing the experience of contemporary Paris, the city of boulevards and department stores and public parks, of gaslight and railway stations and crowds moving through spaces designed for spectacle and commerce. And it was, in these years, the 1860s, sliding into the 1870s, that a group of younger painters began gathering, meeting at cafes, discussing these questions of how to paint the modern world, how to capture not just its appearance but its tempo, its light, its fundamental character as something new in human history. Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Camille Pissarro, they painted together at La Grenouillère, a popular bathing spot on the Seine, setting up their easels side by side, attempting to capture the shimmer of sunlight on water, the movement of figures in summer leisure, the whole scene broken into patches of color, quick brushstrokes that suggested rather than described. This was painting moving outdoors in earnest, not just for studies but for finished works. The development of paint in tubes had made this newly possible. Artists could carry their materials into fields and forests, could work directly before the motif instead of relying on memory and studio convention. Monet became obsessed with this approach, with painting the same subject under different conditions of light and weather, haystacks and poplar trees, and the facade of Rouen Cathedral, returning again and again to observe how morning light differed from afternoon, how fog transformed familiar forms into veils of gray and lavender, how winter snow created entirely different relationships of color and tone. His technique grew increasingly broken, individual brushstrokes visible, patches of pure color placed side by side rather than mixed on the palette. When seen up close, these paintings looked like abstract arrangements, but step back and they cohered into shimmering illusions of atmosphere and light, more convincing in their own way than any smooth academic finish. In 1874, the group organized their first independent exhibition, showing works the Salon had rejected or that they chose not to submit. Monet's Impression Sunrise gave the movement its name, though it was initially meant as an insult, a critic deriding these loose, sketchy works as mere impressions rather than finished paintings. But the artists embraced the term. It captured something essential about their project. They were after impressions, fleeting effects of light and color, the way a scene feels in a particular moment, rather than how it might be analyzed and reconstructed in a studio. They wanted to paint the experience of seeing, not just the things seen. Renoir brought a particular warmth to this approach. His paintings of Parisian leisure, balls and garden parties and cafe terraces, suffused with golden light, figures dappled with shadows from trees, everything suggesting pleasure and abundance, the new bourgeois Paris enjoying itself in public spaces. His luncheon of the boating party captures a group of friends gathered on a terrace overlooking the Seine, glasses of wine and plates of fruit scattered across a white tablecloth, figures in casual conversation, some leaning close, others gazing out at the river, the whole scene structured by alternating areas of light and shadow, warm oranges and cool blues creating spatial depth without linear perspective. Pissarro worked with similar techniques, but toward different ends. His street scenes of Paris, his views of Rouen and other provincial cities possess a more democratic character. He painted workers and markets, rainy days and ordinary traffic, finding beauty in the everyday commerce of urban life, in the rhythms of work and weather. And he painted the countryside around Pontoise with deep affection, orchards and kitchen gardens, peasants tending crops, village streets in different seasons, his brushwork building up surfaces with small touches of varied color, greens inflected with blue and yellow and violet, creating a sense of light filtering through leaves, of air moving across cultivated land. Edgar Degas stood somewhat apart from the others. He rarely painted outdoors, preferring to work in his studio from memory and quick sketches, but he shared their interest in modern subjects, in capturing contemporary Paris through fresh eyes, ballet dancers and laundresses, cafe singers and women bathing, moments of private absorption rendered with penetrating observation. Degas studied movement obsessively, dancers stretching at the bar, horses racing at Longchamp, laundresses pressing heavy irons across fabric. He understood bodies in space, how weight shifted, how gestures revealed character and mood, and he composed his paintings with daring asymmetry, figures cut off by the frame, viewpoints suggesting the casual glance rather than formal arrangement. His pastels, especially, those images of dancers in rehearsal, show his mastery of color and form, layers of vibrant chalk creating effects of extraordinary delicacy, tutus catching light, flesh tones modulated with green and blue shadows, everything suggesting the specific quality of gaslight in theaters, artificial illumination creating its own particular atmosphere. Berthe Morisot brought an intimate domesticity to Impressionism. Paintings of her daughter, of gardens and terraces, of women in interior spaces, her brushwork loose and confident, white dresses rendered with swift strokes of cream and gray and palest blue, capturing the play of light on fabric, on skin, on the surfaces of bourgeois comfort. She exhibited in almost all the Impressionist shows, the only woman to do so with such consistency, and her works possess a distinctive tenderness, attention to private moments, mothers with children, women reading or sewing, the quiet spaces of domestic life elevated through careful observation and lyrical handling of paint. Mary Cassatt, an American working in Paris, developed a similar focus, though her compositions showed the influence of Japanese prints, flattened space, bold outlines, unexpected cropping. She painted mothers and children with unsentimental affection, everyday interactions elevated through formal sophistication, a woman bathing a child, reading a story, simple moments made monumental through scale and composition. The Impressionists faced years of mockery and financial struggle. their paintings dismissed as unfinished, as hasty sketches, mistaken for art, but they persisted, organizing exhibition after exhibition, slowly building an audience that could see what they were attempting, could appreciate the freshness of their vision, the way they had captured something essential about modern experience. By the 1880s, Impressionism had begun to fracture, to evolve in different directions as individual painters pursued their own questions, their own dissatisfactions with what the movement had achieved, the unity of those first exhibitions giving way to more personal investigations. Georges Seurat took the Impressionist interest in color and light and subjected it to scientific analysis. He read treatises on optics, studied theories of color perception, and developed a technique he called divisionism, later known as pointillism, building entire paintings from tiny dots of pure color, each one distinct when viewed up close, merging into coherent forms when seen from proper distance. His A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte took 2 years to complete, every inch of the enormous canvas covered with small touches of paint, figures frozen in leisurely poses, umbrellas and boats and dogs, the whole scene possessing a monumental stillness despite its contemporary subject, as if Seurat had transformed a casual moment into something timeless through sheer methodical application. The painting divided critics. Some admired its systematic approach, its marriage of art and science. Others found it cold, mechanical, lacking the spontaneity that made Impressionism feel alive. But Seurat had demonstrated that the sketch-like techniques of his predecessors could be refined into something more deliberate, more controlled, without sacrificing luminosity. Paul Cézanne, meanwhile, was pursuing an entirely different revolution, working in isolation in Provence, painting Mont Sainte-Victoire again and again, studying how form emerges from color, how space can be constructed through careful modulation of warm and cool tones rather than traditional perspective. Cézanne's canvases from the 1880s and 90s look simple at first: apples on a table, a few pine trees, a mountain seen from his studio, but the longer you observe them, the stranger they become. Tables tilted at impossible angles, multiple viewpoints combined in a single image, forms built from patches of color that seem to shift between flatness and depth. He was after something fundamental, trying to understand the basic structure of perception, how we translate the chaos of visual experience into coherent form. His brushstrokes became architectural, small parallel marks building up surfaces, creating rhythm and solidity. Each painting a kind of meditation on the nature of seeing itself. Fellow painters began to recognize his importance. Younger artists made pilgrimages to Aix-en-Provence to meet him, to understand his methods. He told them to treat nature through the cylinder and the sphere and the cone, to find the geometric foundations underlying organic forms, advice that would echo through the next century. In Paris, in Montmartre, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec painted the city's nightlife with sardonic affection, cabarets and brothels, dancers and prostitutes, the demi-monde rendered with fluid lines and acid colors, his posters for the Moulin Rouge transforming commercial art into something genuinely innovative, bold silhouettes, flat areas of color, Japanese influence filtered through absinthe and gaslight. Lautrec's paintings possess a psychological acuity that can feel almost cruel. He saw through pretense, captured moments of weariness and calculation beneath the performance, a dancer adjusting her costume, a woman waiting for clients, everything rendered with economy and insight, his own physical limitations, his stunted growth from childhood accidents, perhaps sharpening his observation of those who sold their bodies for entertainment. Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris in 1886, his palette still dark from his Dutch period, paintings of peasants rendered in muddy browns and grays. But exposure to Impressionism transformed his approach. Color became brighter, more intense, his brushwork more energetic, swirling and pulsing with an urgency that reflected his turbulent inner life. He moved to Arles in 1888, seeking the intense light of southern France, and there his vision fully flowered, sunflowers blazing yellow against turquoise, wheat fields rippling under violent skies, cypresses twisting like dark flames, everything painted with passionate immediacy, thick applications of paint, creating surfaces that seem almost sculpted. Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo reveal his thinking, his belief that color could express emotion directly, that complementary colors vibrating against each other could create effects more powerful than realistic representation. He wanted his paintings to console, to communicate feeling, to offer something of value to a world that had little use for him while he lived. The bedroom at Arles, the starry night, the flowering trees, these paintings from his final years possess an intensity that still feels overwhelming, as if the world has become purely expressive, every element charged with meaning and emotion, the distinction between inner and outer dissolved in swirling color and urgent mark-making. Paul Gauguin sought escape from European civilization entirely, first to Brittany, where he painted Breton peasants as if they were medieval figures, flattened forms outlined in dark, symbolic rather than naturalistic, then to Tahiti, where he imagined he might find an unspoiled primitive paradise. His Tahitian paintings from the 1890s present an idealized vision of island life. Women in sarongs lounging in tropical landscapes, colors intensified beyond nature, pinks and oranges and deep purples, everything arranged decoratively, less interested in optical truth than in creating images that felt mysterious, spiritual, connected to something primal and elemental. Gauguin rejected Impressionism's focus on fleeting effects. He wanted painting to address eternal questions, to tap into myths and symbols. His canvases combined Christian imagery with Polynesian motifs, creating a personal mythology that was part fantasy, part genuine engagement with Tahitian culture, though always filtered through European romantic projection. In England, the American expatriate James McNeill Whistler was developing his own aesthetic, paintings titled as Nocturnes and Symphonies, emphasizing their kinship with music, their existence as arrangements of color and tone rather than representations of specific places. His nocturne in black and gold showed fireworks over the Thames, the painting almost abstract, touches of gold against dark, the subject barely discernible. When the critic John Ruskin accused him of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, Whistler sued for libel. The trial became a debate about the nature of art itself, whether a painting's value resided in the hours spent making it or in the artistic vision it embodied. Whistler won, but was awarded only a farthing in damages. The legal costs bankrupted him, yet he had made his point that painting need not be about faithful representation, that it could aspire to the condition of music, pure arrangement, form and color existing for their own sake. John Singer Sargent dominated portrait painting in these decades, his technique dazzling. He could capture a face with a few swift strokes, render silk and satin with breathtaking virtuosity. His society portraits showed the wealthy and powerful in all their assured elegance, though occasionally, as in Madame at Guy, his psychological penetration created scandal. But Sargent also painted watercolors of extraordinary freshness, architectural studies in Venice, figures resting in gardens. These looser works revealing his pure pleasure in paint, in capturing effects of light and shadow without the constraints of formal portraiture. Quick notations of seeing that feel utterly contemporary even now. The century drew toward its close, and painting had transformed beyond recognition. The academic certainties of 1800 dissolved, replaced by multiple competing visions, multiple ways of understanding what a painting could be and do. Symbolist painters like Gustave Moreau created canvases dense with mythological imagery, jeweled surfaces, dreamlike narratives, while Nabis artists like Pierre Bonnard and Edouard Vuillard painted intimate domestic scenes, wallpapered rooms, women sewing, everyday life transfigured through pattern and color. In Scandinavia, Edvard Munch was painting anxiety and desire, his The Scream capturing existential dread in swirling lines and acid colors. A figure on a bridge, hands to face, mouth open in silent anguish, the landscape behind warping into undulating bands of orange and blue, as if the world itself vibrates with unbearable feeling. Each painter now seemed to be inventing their own language, their own way of translating experience into paint, the unified styles of earlier academies replaced by radical individualism, by the conviction that art should express personal vision rather than conform to collective standards. The 19th century had begun with painters looking backward, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity, seeking to perpetuate traditions centuries old, but it ended with artists facing forward, embracing the new, the subjective, the experimental, willing to sacrifice beauty for truth, harmony for expression, acceptance for authenticity. And in their studios, in Paris and London and Munich and beyond, painters were already beginning the experiments that would define the coming century, already pushing toward abstraction, toward cubism and fauvism and expressionism, procured the seeds of modernism planted in these final years, germinating in the minds of those who had learned from Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin that painting need not mirror the world, that it could remake it, reimagine it, reveal dimensions of experience that had no other means of expression. The light in those studios, that patient northern light, continued to fall across canvases, across palettes loaded with color, across hands holding brushes, and the work continued as it always had, as it always would, one stroke following another, building worlds from pigment and vision, from observation and imagination, from the inexhaustible human need to see and to show and to understand through the slow, patient accumulation of marks on surface. The question of what these painters were actually doing, what they believed they were accomplishing in those hours of patient application, deserves deeper consideration, because they were not simply recording what they saw. They were constructing entire philosophies of vision, entire theories of how the visible world relates to human consciousness and experience. Consider the simple act of choosing a subject, Monet, standing before a haystack, deciding that this ordinary agricultural form contains within it something worth sustained attention, worth returning to again and again across seasons. That decision itself represents a radical revaluation of what matters, what deserves to be seen and celebrated and preserved. The haystack becomes a kind of collaborator in the investigation, its surface catching light differently at dawn than at noon than at dusk, its cylindrical form creating shadows that shift as the sun arcs across the sky. Monet was not painting haystacks. He was painting time itself, the way moments accumulate into days, the way looking closely at anything reveals infinite variation. And this sustained attention requires a kind of love, or at least a deep curiosity about the nature of appearance, because the eye must be convinced to see past habit, past the mental shortcuts that allow us to navigate the world efficiently, but blind us to its actual character, its moment-by-moment transformation. The Impressionists trained themselves to see like children, or like people who had just gained sight after a lifetime of blindness, to notice the violet shadows on snow, the orange reflections in water at sunset, the way flesh is never simply pink, but contains greens and blues and yellows, all the colors the mind edits out in the interest of recognizing skin as a category rather than experiencing it as a phenomenon. This required unlearning as much as learning, setting aside the formulas taught in academies, the received wisdom about how trees should be painted or water or sky, trusting instead the direct report of the senses, however strange or counterintuitive that report might seem. Cézanne took this project even further, deeper into the structure of perception itself. He understood that we do not see the world from a single fixed point. Our eyes move constantly, our head shifts, our body sways slightly, and our mind assembles these multiple glimpses into a coherent image that actually represents a synthesis, a construction, not a pure recording. So his paintings incorporate this movement, show objects from slightly different angles simultaneously, create space through color relationships rather than linear perspective, the mountain seen from here and also from there, the table both flat and tilted, everything true to the actual process of seeing, even as it violates the conventions of pictorial representation. This is painting as a form of epistemology, a way of investigating how we know what we know, how visual information becomes understanding, how patches of color and degrees of lightness resolve into the experience of a three-dimensional world populated with objects and space and atmosphere. And there is something profound in the way these painters devoted their lives to questions that could never be fully answered, because light is infinite in its variations, because no two moments are ever precisely the same, because the world continuously offers more than any painting can contain, and yet the attempt must be made, the effort itself constituting a kind of meaning. Van Gogh understood this. His letters speak of wanting to paint infinity, to suggest through color and movement something that transcends the physical scene. A cypress tree becomes a dark flame reaching toward heaven. A wheat field becomes a symbol of life's abundance and fragility, everything charged with significance beyond its literal identity. His paintings feel urgent because he knew his time was limited, felt the pressure of everything he wanted to express, needed to communicate, and so the paint goes on thickly, swirling, pulsing, as if the canvas cannot contain the energy he pours into it. as if the world itself vibrates with more meaning than any single work can hold. This urgency stands in contrast to Cézanne's patient deliberation, his willingness to work on a single painting for months or years, adding small touches, reconsidering relationships, seeking a balance that satisfied his exacting sense of structure. Both approaches equally valid, equally necessary, different temperaments, finding different paths to similar goals. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of 19th century painting, that there is no single correct way to see, no single truth about appearance, only individual visions, each partial, each revealing something the others miss. Monet's shimmer and Cézanne's solidity, and Van Gogh's expressiveness and Degas' psychological acuity, all needed, all contributing to a larger understanding of what painting can be and do. The studios where this work happened were not romantic garrets. Well, some were, but many were professional spaces, organized for the practical business of making art. Tables for mixing paint, north-facing windows for consistent light, storage for canvases and stretchers and frames, the physical infrastructure required for sustained creative production. And the painters themselves were not isolated geniuses. They were part of communities, arguing in cafes, writing letters, visiting each other's studios, learning from and influencing one another. Art emerging from conversation and collaboration as much as from solitary inspiration. This social dimension matters because painting in the 19th century was also about building alternative structures, creating exhibition spaces outside official channels, developing markets that did not depend on academic approval, establishing the possibility of artistic independence, of making work according to personal conviction rather than institutional expectation. The Impressionist exhibitions, the Salon des Refusés, the independent galleries, these were not just venues for showing art. They were assertions of autonomy, declarations that painters could determine for themselves what mattered, could address audiences directly without institutional mediation, and slowly, gradually, over decades, this independence became normalized. The idea that artists should be free to pursue their vision, however unconventional, however challenging to established taste. This became part of the culture's understanding of what art is and how it functions. The 19th century gave us this gift, this expansion of possibility, this multiplication of approaches, so that by 1900 painting contained multitudes, realism and symbolism and impressionism and post-impressionism and countless individual variations, each valid, each offering its own particular insight. And now, at this late hour, with the century closed and its painters long since gone, their canvases remain, hanging in museums and private collections, still capable of stopping us in our tracks, still able to make us see differently. I think of standing before a Monet, how the surface dissolves up close into pure abstraction, just color and texture, and then stepping back, watching it cohere into water lilies floating on a pond, light filtering through willow branches, the miracle of representation emerging from chaos, from the accumulation of individual marks, each one a small decision, a commitment to a particular hue, a specific placement, or a Cézanne still life, apples on a table. Such a simple subject, and yet the longer you look, the more complex it becomes, the way the table seems to tilt, the way space compresses and expands, the way color creates form. You could spend hours with a single painting and not exhaust its possibilities, not fully grasp all the relationships Cézanne has orchestrated. This is what these painters left us, not just beautiful objects, though many are beautiful, but new ways of attending to the world, new possibilities for awareness. They trained themselves to see, and in doing so, trained us, expanded our capacity for noticing, for appreciating, for finding meaning in light and color and form. The studios are empty now, the palettes cleaned, the brushes laid down, but the work persists, continues to teach, continues to offer its particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge that comes through looking, through patient, sustained attention to appearance, through the willingness to be surprised by what is right in front of us. I imagine those painters, Monet in his garden at Giverny, Cézanne on the hillside above Aix, Berthe Morisot in her Paris apartment, all of them engaged in the same essential activity, trying to translate the visible world into something that could be shared, could be preserved, could speak to people they would never meet in times they could not imagine. And here we are, more than a century later, still receiving that communication, still standing before their canvases, still learning to see through their eyes, still grateful for their dedication, their persistence, their refusal to accept that the old ways were the only ways. That tradition should constrain vision. The light continues to fall, even now, across fields and cities, across water and mountains, across all the surfaces of the world, and somewhere people are still painting, still trying to capture something of that light, still engaged in the ancient patient work of making images, continuing conversations these 19th century masters began. Their voices fade now into the general silence, into the accumulated history of art, but they are not lost. They persist in every painting made with attention, in every attempt to see clearly, to honor what appears, to find in the visible world something worth preserving. The canvases wait in their museums, in their quiet galleries, patient as the painters who made them, ready to speak to anyone willing to look, to stand still long enough to receive what they offer. These windows into other ways of seeing, these invitations to notice, to appreciate, to understand through the eloquent, silent language of paint on surface. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps that is everything, to have seen clearly, to have recorded faithfully, to have found in ordinary subjects, in light and shadow and color, something extraordinary, something that justifies the hours, the years, the lifetimes spent in studios, before easels, seeking always that next stroke, that next color, that next small step toward capturing what cannot quite be captured, but must nonetheless be attempted. The attempt itself, the sustained effort, the daily return to the work, this is the real subject, the deepest meaning, not the finished paintings, beautiful as they are, but the process, the practice, the commitment to seeing, to making, to offering what vision discovers to a world that might not immediately understand, but might someday, in time, come to value what these patient, dedicated souls created. And so the story ends where it began, with light falling across canvas, with painters long gone, but their work remaining, with the quiet knowledge that some things persist, some efforts bear fruit across generations, some seeing changes how we all see forever. The studios are dark now, the windows closed, but the paintings glow still. In galleries, in books, in memory, continuing their patient work of teaching us to see, to notice, to attend to the inexhaustible beauty of the visible world